The evening of May the 15th, 1848, would forever remain etched in Lady Arabella Fairfax's memory as the night her heart shattered into 1,000 crystalline pieces upon the polished marble floor of the Whitmore ballroom. She had arrived at the grand townhouse on Berkeley Square with her elderly chaperone, Mrs. Gardiner. Her modest gown of pale lavender silk, a quiet contrast to the jewel-toned satins and elaborate embroidery worn by ladies of greater fortune. At 23, Arabella possessed the kind of beauty that revealed itself slowly, like dawn breaking over a misty landscape. Her features were regular rather than striking, her figure slender and graceful, and her dark brown hair fell in soft waves that framed a face notable primarily for its expressiveness and the intelligence that shone from eyes the color of warm honey. She had no great dowry to recommend her, no powerful family connections to elevate her status, merely a modest competence left by her late father and the small estate in Derbyshire that provided barely enough income to maintain her mother and younger sister in genteel comfort. What she did possess, however, was a mind that delighted in literature and philosophy, a genuine warmth of character that endeared her to those who knew her well, and a secret that had burned in her breast for 2 full seasons. She was desperately, hopelessly, completely in love with Frederick Wentworth, the Duke of Claiborne, a man so far above her in rank and fortune that her affection was nothing short of foolishness. The Whitmore ballroom blazed with the light of 3 magnificent chandeliers, their countless candles reflecting off gilded mirrors and casting a warm glow over the assembled cream of London society. Ladies in their finest gowns clustered in groups, their fans fluttering like butterfly wings as they exchanged gossip, while gentlemen in severe black evening coats stood in conversation near the tall windows that overlooked the square. The orchestra occupied a raised platform at the far end of the room, and the air was heavy with the mingled scents of beeswax, perfume, and the elaborate floral arrangements that adorned every available surface. Arabella stood near a marble column, partially concealed from the main press of the crowd, as was her custom at such events. She had learned over the years that her modest circumstances made her an object of neither particular interest nor outright disdain, rendering her effectively invisible to most of the ton. This suited her well enough, as it allowed her to observe without being observed, to watch the intricate dance of society from a safe distance. Tonight, however, her usual position of quiet observation served a more painful purpose. From where she stood, she had an unobstructed view of the raised dais where Lord Whitmore stood with several distinguished guests, and among them, towering over the others with the unconscious authority that came from both his impressive height and his ancient title, was Frederick. The Duke of Claiborne was 38 years of age, with the kind of aristocratic features that seemed carved from stone until something amused him, and his rare smile transformed his entire countenance. His hair was dark, almost black, with distinguished threads of silver at the temples, and his eyes were a striking pale grey that could appear cold as winter frost or warm as morning mist depending on his mood. He possessed broad shoulders that filled his perfectly tailored coat admirably, and moved with the unconscious grace of a man completely comfortable in his own skin and certain of his place in the world. For 2 seasons, Arabella had nurtured her hopeless attachment, treasuring every small interaction between them. There had been a dance at the Moorland Musicale 16 months ago, during which he had actually laughed at her observation about the soprano's dramatic interpretation of a rather simple piece. There had been a chance meeting at Hatchard's bookshop, where they had spent 20 glorious minutes discussing the merits of the new novel by Mr. Dickens. There had been a garden party at the Tilney estate, where he had sought her out specifically to continue a conversation about Italian art that they had begun at a previous gathering. She knew these encounters meant nothing to him, merely pleasant interludes with an agreeable acquaintance, but to her they were precious jewels to be examined and treasured in the privacy of her chamber. She had never allowed herself to believe that anything could come of her feelings, had never been so foolish as to imagine that a duke would look twice at a lady of her limited circumstances. But she had also never quite managed to extinguish the small, stubborn flame of hope that burned somewhere deep in her chest. The orchestra fell silent midway through a country dance, and a ripple of curiosity passed through the assembled guests as Lord Whitmore raised his hand for attention. Arabella felt her heart begin to beat faster, though she could not have said why. Perhaps it was merely the presence of Frederick on the dais, his tall figure impossible to ignore, even in a room crowded with London's elite. Lord Whitmore's voice carried easily across the now silent ballroom as he announced that his dear friend, the Duke of Claiborne, had requested the honor of sharing some happy news with those gathered. Arabella watched as Frederick stepped forward, his expression unreadable, his posture perfect. He surveyed the crowd with those pale grey eyes, and for just one moment, one heartbeat, his gaze seemed to find hers across the distance, seemed to hold there for a fraction of a second before moving on. Then he spoke, his deep voice clear and firm, and the words fell upon Arabella like blows from a hammer. He was pleased to announce his engagement to Lady Henrietta Dashwood, daughter of the Earl of Pemberton, a union that would join two ancient and distinguished families. The ballroom erupted in a chorus of congratulations and excited whispers, but Arabella heard none of it. Her vision tunneled, the glittering scene before her wavering as though she viewed it through water. Lady Henrietta Dashwood. Of course, the Earl's daughter was everything Arabella was not, a diamond of the first water with pale blonde hair, classical features of striking beauty, and a dowry rumoured to be in excess of £30,000. She was cold in manner, with a reputation for cutting wit and social ambition, but she was eminently suitable for a duke. Arabella's stays, which her maid had laced that morning with the usual firmness, suddenly felt as though they were crushing her ribs, preventing air from reaching her lungs. The room spun, the candlelight from the chandeliers blurring into streaks of gold against the darkness creeping in from the edges of her vision. She tried to draw breath, tried to maintain her composure, tried to do anything other than what she was about to do. But her body had other ideas. The last thing she registered before darkness claimed her completely was the cool smoothness of marble against her cheek as the floor rushed up to meet her, and the eruption of shocked gasps and exclamations that her collapse provoked. Consciousness returned slowly, bringing with it awareness of softness beneath her, the acrid scent of smelling salts, and voices speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Arabella's eyelids felt impossibly heavy, but she forced them open to find herself lying upon a velvet settee in what appeared to be a private parlour off the main ballroom. The room was smaller, more intimate, decorated in shades of cream and gold with a fire crackling gently in the hearth. Mrs. Gardiner's anxious face swam into view, her elderly features creased with concern, but it was not her chaperone's voice that Arabella heard first. It was his. Frederick's deep tones, rough with something that might have been worry, instructing someone to fetch water and to give her air. Arabella turned her head, confused and disoriented, to find the Duke of Claiborne himself kneeling beside the settee. His coat discarded, his cravat slightly loosened, his pale eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. His fingers, long and elegant, rested against her wrist, checking her pulse with a familiarity that should have been scandalous. The impropriety of the situation began to penetrate her foggy awareness. He had carried her here. She knew this with sudden certainty, could almost feel the phantom sensation of being lifted against a broad chest, cradled in strong arms. The Duke of Claiborne, who had just announced his engagement to another woman, had carried her unconscious form from the ballroom in full view of London society. The scandal would be tremendous. Mrs. Gardiner was speaking now, her voice fluttering with distress about the heat of the ballroom and Arabella's delicate constitution, but Frederick seemed not to hear her. He leaned closer, so close that Arabella could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, could detect the faint scent of sandalwood, and something uniquely him. His lips moved, forming words so quiet that only she could hear them. words that made no sense yet sent a shiver down her spine despite her confusion. "Trust me, Arabella. This engagement is a cage I am building, but not for myself. For the wolf hunting you." Before she could respond, before she could even process the meaning of his cryptic message, the parlor door swept open and Lady Henrietta Dashwood entered in a rustle of ice-blue silk. She was even more beautiful up close than from a distance, with features of such classical perfection they might have been sculpted by a Greek master. Her pale blue eyes took in the scene before her, the Duke kneeling at another woman's side, and something flickered across her face too quickly to identify before her expression settled into one of cool concern. Behind her came Mrs. Gardiner's niece, who had apparently been sent to fetch the chaperone, and several other ladies drawn by curiosity. Frederick rose immediately, his movements fluid despite his size, and stepped back from the settee with the proper distance society demanded. His expression had shifted, transformed from the intensity of moments before into the cool, aristocratic mask Arabella recognized from public gatherings. He bowed formally to Lady Henrietta, who extended her hand to him with the proprietary air of a woman claiming what was hers. "My dear Duke," Lady Henrietta said, her voice like crystal, beautiful but cold, "how fortunate that you were near when poor Lady Fairfax took ill. Such a kind heart you have, to concern yourself with her welfare." The words were perfectly appropriate, but something in their delivery, some subtle emphasis, felt like a verbal blade disguised in silk. Arabella struggled to sit up, mortification flooding through her as the full weight of what had occurred crashed over her consciousness. She had fainted at the announcement of Frederick's engagement like some weak-spirited maiden from a Gothic novel. She had caused a scene at one of the season's most important balls. She had been carried, unconscious and helpless, by the very man whose engagement had caused her collapse, and now she lay here, while his intended bride looked on with those cold, assessing eyes. Mrs. Gardiner fussed over her, pressing a glass of water into her hands and suggesting they depart immediately for home, but Arabella could not seem to make her limbs cooperate. Her mind kept circling back to Frederick's whispered words, trying to extract meaning from them. A cage for the wolf hunting you. What wolf? Who was hunting her? And why would Frederick's engagement to Lady Henrietta provide protection? None of it made sense, and yet the urgency in his voice had been unmistakable, as had been something else she dared not name. Frederick was speaking now, his voice returned to its usual measured tones, as he assured Mrs. Gardiner that such episodes were not uncommon in overheated ballrooms, that Lady Fairfax should not distress herself, that he was certain she would recover quickly with proper rest. He did not look at Arabella again, did not acknowledge by word or glance the intimate moment they had shared, the cryptic warning he had delivered. Instead, he offered his arm to Lady Henrietta and suggested they return to the ballroom where their guests awaited. Lady Henrietta accepted with a smile that did not reach her eyes, but before they departed, she paused beside the settee where Arabella sat and bent down as though to offer some private word of comfort. What she actually whispered, her voice so low that only Arabella could hear, sent another shock through her already overwhelmed system. "He does care for you, you know, more than is wise. That is precisely why this must appear real." Then she straightened, her public smile firmly in place, and swept from the room on Frederick's arm, leaving Arabella to wonder if she had imagined the entire exchange, or if she had somehow stumbled into a plot whose parameters she could not begin to comprehend. Mrs. Gardiner insisted they leave immediately, and Arabella, still shaky and desperately wanting to escape the pitying and curious glances of the other ladies, agreed without protest. As their modest carriage rolled through the lamplit streets of London toward their small house in Bloomsbury, Arabella stared out at the passing buildings and tried to make sense of the evening's extraordinary events. Frederick was engaged to Lady Henrietta Dashwood. This was fact, announced publicly before hundreds of witnesses. Yet he had whispered of cages and wolves, had looked at her with an intensity that belied mere friendly concern, and his intended bride had made that strange, conspiratorial comment that suggested she knew of his feelings and somehow approved of them. It made no sense. Nothing made sense. And yet beneath her confusion and heartbreak, beneath the humiliation of her very public collapse, a small seed of hope had taken root, dangerous and impossible to ignore. Whatever game was being played, whatever mysterious threat Frederick had alluded to, one thing seemed increasingly clear. His engagement to Lady Henrietta was not what it appeared to be, and somehow, impossibly, Arabella herself was at the very center of it all. The note arrived on the third morning after the Whitmore ball, slipped beneath the door of the modest Bloomsbury townhouse that Arabella shared with her mother and younger sister, discovered by the maid when she came to lay the morning fire. It was a single sheet of expensive cream paper, folded and sealed with plain wax bearing no identifying mark, and the direction was written in a hand Arabella did not immediately recognize, though something about the bold, decisive strokes made her pulse quicken even before she broke the seal. The message inside was brief, almost curt in its brevity. Vauxhall Gardens, The Maze, twilight today. Come alone. Trust no one with this note. There was no signature, no explanation, nothing to indicate who had sent it or why they requested such a clandestine meeting in a location notorious for romantic assignations and scandalous encounters. Every rational part of Arabella's mind screamed that she should ignore this summons, should show the note to Mrs. Gardiner, or perhaps even to her mother, should certainly not venture alone to meet an unknown correspondent as dusk fell over London. Yet she knew with a certainty that defied logic that the note had come from Frederick, that his hand had formed those letters even if he had disguised his usual script, that he needed to speak with her away from the prying eyes and eager ears of society. The 3 days since the ball had been an agony of confusion and speculation. The morning papers had been full of the Duke of Claiborne's engagement to Lady Henrietta Dashwood, describing it as the match of the season, speculating on the wedding date, and listing in tedious detail the combined wealth and influence the union would bring to both families. There had been, mercifully, only brief mention of a lady taken ill during the announcement, with no name attached to spare Arabella the additional humiliation of being identified as the woman who had collapsed at the news. She had remained at home, pleading a continued indisposition, unable to face the inevitable questions and barely concealed pity that would await her in society's drawing rooms. Her mother, a vague and gentle woman who had never quite recovered from the shock of being widowed at 40, had fussed over her with tisanes and concern, while her sister Lydia, at 17 full of romantic notions and dramatic sensibilities, had declared the whole business monstrously unfair and insisted that the Duke must have been coerced into the engagement by family pressure. Arabella had said nothing, had kept Frederick's cryptic words locked away in her heart, examining them in the privacy of her chamber like a miser counting coins. A cage for the wolf hunting ewe. She had turned the phrase over and over, trying to extract meaning, trying to identify who this wolf might be and why Frederick believed her in danger. Now, it seemed, she would have answers. The day passed with agonizing slowness, each hour marked by the elegant French clock in the drawing-room that had been her grandmother's and was one of the few valuable items remaining from better days. Arabella pleaded a headache to avoid joining her mother and sister for their usual afternoon calls, and instead retired to her chamber to prepare for the evening's secret expedition. She selected a walking dress of dark grey merino wool, practical and unremarkable, with a hooded cloak that would help conceal her identity in the fading light. Her maid, Jenny, a girl of 15 who had been with the family since childhood and could be trusted with secrets, helped. Her dress and said nothing about the unusual choice of attire for a lady supposedly confined to bed with illness. As the light began to fade from the spring sky, Arabella slipped from the house through the servants' entrance, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had told her mother she would take an early night, and with luck would return before her absence was discovered. The streets of London at twilight were a different world from the genteel avenues she traversed during daylight hours. Lamplighters made their rounds, touching flame to gas lamps that bloomed like flowers against the gathering darkness, while vendors called their final wares and workers hurried home to their suppers. Arabella kept her hood pulled low and moved quickly, aware of her vulnerability as a woman alone, but driven by a need stronger than caution. She hired a hackney cab at the corner, giving the driver directions to Vauxhall Gardens in a voice she tried to keep steady. The pleasure gardens were a popular destination for all classes of London society, from aristocrats seeking entertainment to merchants' families enjoying a holiday. But they were also known as a place where anonymity could be purchased, and discretion was the unofficial currency. The driver gave her a knowing look that made her cheeks burn, but accepted her fare without comment and set off through the crowded streets toward the river. The journey across the Thames seemed to take an eternity, and Arabella used the time to rehearse what she might say to Frederick, how she might maintain her composure in his presence, how she might keep her heart from revealing itself too plainly. The gardens were already illuminated when she arrived. Thousands of colored lamps strung through the trees and along the walking paths, creating a fairy tale atmosphere that belied the often questionable activities that occurred in the darker corners of the grounds. Arabella paid the driver and entered through the main gate, where revelers in various states of gaiety milled about, some already showing the effects of the wine and arak punch for which the gardens were famous. She moved through the crowds with her head down, following the well-worn paths toward the famous maze that occupied the eastern section of the ground. The maze at Vauxhall was constructed of high hedges of hornbeam and yew, planted so densely that they formed walls of living green through which no eye could penetrate. It had been designed a century earlier by a landscape architect with a fondness for geometric complexity, and its twisting paths and dead ends had frustrated and delighted visitors for generations. By day it was a pleasant diversion. By twilight it became something else entirely, a shadowy labyrinth where the sounds of the outside world grew muffled and distant, where one might wander for half an hour trying to find the center or the exit. Arabella entered the maze as the last light bled from the sky, her pulse racing as the hedge walls rose, up on either side, blocking out the lamp-lit festivities of the main gardens. She moved slowly, one gloved hand trailing along the hedge to keep her bearings, as the path twisted left, then right, then left again. The air was cool and slightly damp, carrying the green scent of growing things and the distant sound of music from the orchestra pavilion. She had no idea how to find Frederick in this leafy labyrinth, had no plan beyond walking until he found her, and was just beginning to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake, when a figure materialized from the mist that was gathering in the low places between the hedges. He stood at the junction of two paths, tall and unmistakable even in silhouette, and relief flooded through her so powerfully that she nearly stumbled. Frederick moved toward her quickly, closing the distance between them in a few long strides, and she saw that he wore dark, plain clothing rather than his usual aristocratic attire, as though he too sought to avoid recognition. His face, as the fading light caught it, was grave, almost harsh, with lines of strain around his mouth that she had not noticed 3 nights ago. He glanced past her down the path she had taken, checking that she had not been followed, before his pale eyes settled on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You came," he said, and there was relief in his voice mixed with something darker. "I was not certain you would after my cryptic message." "I almost did not," Arabella admitted, trying to keep her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. It was foolish to come alone to such a place, on the word of an unsigned note. It was, Frederick agreed, a muscle working in his jaw. "But I could think of no other way to speak with you privately. What I must tell you cannot be overheard, and every drawing-room in London has ears." He gestured down one of the paths. "Walk with me. I know the way to the centre. No one will disturb us there." Arabella fell into step beside him, acutely aware of his presence, of the breadth of his shoulders beneath the dark coat, of the way he shortened his naturally long stride to match hers. They walked in silence for several minutes, navigating the twists and turns of the maze until they emerged into the circular clearing at its heart. Here, a stone bench sat beneath an ancient oak tree, and the hedge walls created a private room open only to the darkening sky above. Frederick waited until she was seated before he began to speak, and when he did, his words came quickly, as though he had been holding them back for too long. "There is a man, Lord Edmund Bennet, Earl of Ashford. Do you know him?" Arabella searched her memory, finally placing the name with a face she had glimpsed occasionally at society gatherings. "I know of him. A gentleman of perhaps 35, fair-haired, with political connections." She paused, recalling darker rumors. There have been whispers about him. Debts. Scandal. Nothing proven, but much suspected. Frederick's expression darkened further. "The whispers do not tell half of it. Bennet is ruined, financially and morally. He has gambled away his fortune, alienated his family, and is now desperate to recover his position by any means necessary. His estates are mortgaged to the hilt, his creditors grow impatient, and he faces complete disgrace unless he can secure a substantial infusion of capital." Arabella frowned, not understanding what this had to do with her. Surely there are heiresses aplenty for such a man to pursue. "Why tell me of his troubles?" "Because," Frederick said, his voice dropping to a tone of suppressed anger, "you are the solution he has fixed upon. Not for your dowry, which he knows is modest, but for your land." She stared at him in confusion. "My land? I have no land beyond my father's small estate, which provides barely enough income to maintain my mother and sister. The estate itself is entailed and will pass to my cousin upon my mother's death. I am hardly an heiress worth pursuing. It is not the Derbyshire property that interests him." Frederick explained, moving closer to the bench, though he remained standing. "It is your mother's inheritance, the Moorland property." Arabella's breath caught. Her mother's maiden name had been Moorland, and there was indeed a small parcel of land in Kent that had come to her through her maternal grandfather, land that was not entailed and had passed to Arabella as the eldest daughter upon her father's death. It was a modest holding, barely 200 acres of farmland and woods, managed by a local steward and providing a tiny income that helped supplement the family's limited funds. "I do not understand," she said slowly. "The moorland land is worth perhaps £2,000 if sold. Surely that is insufficient to solve Lord Bennet's problems." "It is not the current value that interests him," Frederick said grimly. "It is the location. Your land sits directly adjacent to the proposed route of the new railway line that will connect London to Dover. The railway company has been quietly purchasing rights of way, and your property is one of the key parcels they need. Bennet discovered this through his political connections, and has also learned that the company is prepared to pay 10 times the land's current value to secure it. With that money, he could pay his most pressing debts and restore his credit enough to continue his lifestyle of dissolution." Arabella rose from the bench, her mind racing. "But the land is mine. He cannot simply take it. I would never agree to sell to such a man, even if he offered a fair price." Frederick's expression was grim. "He does not plan to ask your permission, Arabella. He plans to force you into marriage. Once you are his wife, control of your property passes to him automatically. He can sell the land without your consent and use the proceeds as he wishes, leaving you trapped in a marriage to a man of vicious temperament and ruined character." The words hit her, like physical blows. But how could he force such a marriage? I would refuse. My family would protect me. The law requires my consent. Bennet is not a man constrained by law or decency, Frederick said, his voice tight with controlled fury. I have learned through my own sources that he has already laid the groundwork. He has been making inquiries about your habits, your movements, the company you keep. He plans to engineer a compromising situation, To trap you in a scandal that would make marriage to him seem the only way to preserve your reputation. Once your name is ruined, your family would have little choice but to accept his offer, particularly if he presented himself as the gentleman willing to save you from disgrace. Arabella sank back onto the bench, her legs suddenly unable to support her. This could not be happening. Such things occurred in sensation novels, not to ordinary ladies living quiet lives in Bloomsbury. Yet even as she tried to reject Frederick's words, she could not deny the ring of truth in them. She had noticed, now that she thought back, a gentleman matching Bennet's description at several gatherings she had attended, always seeming to be nearby, always watching. She had dismissed it as coincidence, but now it took on a more sinister meaning. "How do you know all this?" she asked, looking up at Frederick's face. "How did you discover his plans?" "I have friends in positions of influence," Frederick replied. "When I noticed Bennet's attention fixed on you at the Pemberton Musicale last month, I made inquiries. What I learned alarmed me enough to take action." His mouth twisted bitterly. "Though my action has caused you pain, for which I am deeply sorry." "The engagement to Lady Henrietta?" Arabella breathed, understanding dawning. "It is part of your plan to protect me." "Yes," Frederick said simply. "Bennet believes I have shown you particular attention over the past 2 seasons. If he suspects that you have any claim on my affections, he might hesitate, fearing that a duke could be a dangerous enemy. But if I am safely engaged to another woman, if I appear to have dismissed you entirely, then he will believe the path is clear. He will not suspect that I am actually watching his every move, positioning myself to intervene if he makes any attempt to enact his scheme." Arabella pressed a hand to her chest, where her heart felt as though it might break through her ribs. "You have sacrificed your own happiness to protect me. You have bound yourself to a woman you do not love, all to keep me safe from a threat I did not even know existed." Frederick's jaw tightened, and he took a step closer, his hand rising as though to touch her face before he caught himself and let it fall back to his side. "My happiness was never in question, Arabella. It was decided 2 years ago, from the moment you laughed at my terrible poetry at the Moorland Musicale, from the moment you told me that sincerity mattered more than technical perfection in art. I have been yours from that night, whether you knew it or not, whether anything could come of it or not." The admission hung in the air between them, shimmering with possibility and pain. Arabella rose again, moving toward him without conscious thought, her whole being drawn to this man who had just revealed the depth of his regard in the most devastating way possible. "But what of you, Frederick?" she whispered, using his given name without thinking, without caring about propriety or proper address. "What of your happiness? What of what might have been between us if circumstances were different?" His pale eyes blazed in the gathering darkness, and for a moment she thought he might close the distance between them, might take her in his arms as she desperately wished he would. But he held himself rigidly in check, every line of his body speaking of restraint and sacrifice. "What might have been does not matter," he said, though his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "What matters is keeping you safe. Bennet is dangerous, Arabella. He is a man with nothing left to lose, which makes him capable of anything. I could not stand by and watch him destroy you. I would rather bind myself to a marriage of convenience for the rest of my life than see you trapped with such a man." "But Lady Henrietta?" Arabella protested, tears pricking at her eyes. "To tie yourself to a woman you do not love, to live a lie for years, perhaps for a lifetime." "Henrietta understands the arrangement," Frederick said. "She has her own reasons for accepting an engagement that is more strategic than romantic. We have an understanding, she and I. The marriage, if it comes to that, will be one of mutual respect, if not passion. She gets the title and position she desires, and I get a duchess who will not expect from me what I cannot give." His meaning was painfully clear. He could not give love to Lady Henrietta because his heart was already given, given to Arabella herself, given without hope of return or reciprocation. The generosity of his sacrifice, the magnitude of what he was offering, overwhelmed her completely. She reached out, her hand finding his in the darkness, and felt his fingers close around hers with a grip that bordered on desperate. "I cannot accept this," she said, though she did not release his hand. "I cannot allow you to sacrifice everything for my sake. There must be another way. We could go to the authorities. We could warn my family. I could leave London entirely. Every option has risks." Frederick replied, his thumb stroking across the back of her hand in a caress that seemed unconscious. "If we go to the authorities, Bennet's political connections might protect him. And worse, he would know we are aware of his plans. He would simply adjust his strategy, perhaps act more quickly before we can counter him. If you flee London, he might follow, and you would be more vulnerable away from the protection of society. The engagement to Henrietta is the safest option because it allows me to remain close, to monitor Bennet's movements, to position myself to intervene the moment he makes any move against you." "But you should not have to do this alone," Arabella insisted. "Let me help. Let me be part of whatever plan you are making." Frederick's expression softened slightly. "You are helping simply by being aware of the danger. I needed you to know why I announced my engagement so publicly, why I have seemed to distance myself from you. I could not bear the thought that you believed I had simply dismissed you, that our friendship meant nothing to me." His free hand did rise to her face then, his fingertips brushing her cheek with a tenderness that made her eyes close. "You have been the light in my life for 2 years, Arabella. Every conversation, every dance, every moment in your presence has been treasured beyond what I can express. I needed you to know that before I became unavailable to you in the eyes of the world." Arabella opened her eyes to find his face very close to hers, close enough that she could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, could count the darker flecks in his pale irises, could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. In that moment, surrounded by hedge walls and gathering mist, hidden from the world that would judge and condemn, she allowed herself to acknowledge what she had hidden even from herself. She was not just attracted to Frederick Wentworth. She was not merely fond of him or admiring of his character. She loved him with a depth and completeness that terrified her, loved him with every fibre of her being, and the knowledge that he returned her feelings, even as he bound himself to another, was both the greatest joy and the deepest pain she had ever known. "I love you," she whispered, the words escaping before she could call them back. "I know I should not say it. I know it changes nothing. But I cannot let you make this sacrifice without knowing that your feelings are returned, that you are loved as deeply as you love." For a moment, just one perfect, impossible moment, Frederick's control shattered. He pulled her against him, his arms coming around her with a fierceness that spoke of long restraint finally breaking, and his lips found hers in a kiss that was both desperate and tender, claiming and cherishing. Arabella melted into his embrace, her hands fisting in his coat, her whole world narrowing to the sensation of his mouth on hers, the solid strength of his body, the overwhelming rightness of being held by him. But the moment could not last. Frederick drew back with visible effort, his breathing unsteady, his hands trembling slightly as he set her gently away from him. "Forgive me," he said roughly. "I should not have done that. I had no right." "You had every right," Arabella countered, though she too was shaking. "We both did. If this is all we can have, one moment of truth in a maze of shadows, then I am grateful for it." Frederick's expression was anguished. "You deserve so much more than stolen moments and secret meetings. You deserve a man who can court you openly, who can offer you marriage and a future without shadows. You deserve happiness, Arabella, as do you," she replied softly. "But we do not always get what we deserve in this life, do we? We get what circumstances allow." He had no answer for that, and for a long moment they stood in silence, the weight of impossibility settling over them like the mist that now filled the maze completely. Finally, Frederick straightened, visibly pulling his ducal armor back into place, though she could see the cost it exacted in the tightness around his eyes. "You should return home before you are missed," he said, his voice once again controlled, though still rough at the edges. "I will wait here for a quarter hour before I leave to ensure we are not seen together." Arabella nodded, knowing he was right, but hating the necessity of parting. She moved toward the path that would lead her back to the maze entrance, back to the world of propriety and pretense, but paused after a few steps to look back at him. "Frederick," she said, and he turned to her immediately, hope and pain warring in his expression. "Whatever happens, whatever comes of this tangle we find ourselves in, know that I trust you. I trust your judgment and your plan, and I will wait, however long it takes, until we can be together openly, or until you release me from that hope. Do not wait for me, Arabella," he said, though his voice broke on the words. "You are young yet. You should find a good man who can offer you everything I cannot." "I am 23, she replied with a sad smile. "Hardly in my first youth, and as for finding another man, I fear my heart is quite settled on its choice. Even if I can never have you, I will have no one else." "Then we are both doomed to lives of longing," Frederick said quietly, "for I am equally decided. No woman will ever hold my heart as you do." With that bleak acknowledgment hanging between them, Arabella turned and walked into the mist, following the hedge walls by touch more than sight, her eyes too blurred with tears to see clearly. Behind her, she heard nothing, but she felt Frederick's presence like a physical thing, felt his gaze following her until the twisting paths took her from his sight. The journey home passed in a blur, and it was only when she was safely back in her own chamber, the door locked behind her, that Arabella allowed herself to collapse onto her bed and weep for what she had found and lost in the space of a single twilight meeting. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The week following the meeting in Vauxhall Gardens passed in a strange, suspended state where Arabella moved through the rhythms of daily life while feeling utterly disconnected from them. She attended the usual round of morning calls with her mother, sat through musicales and card parties with appropriate expressions of interest, and pretended that her world had not been fundamentally altered by the revelations in the maze. Yet beneath the surface calm, her mind churned constantly with thoughts of Frederick, of the danger Lord Bennet represented, and of the impossible situation in which they all found themselves trapped. She had not seen Frederick since that twilight meeting, though she scanned every ballroom and gathering with desperate hope, knowing even as she did so that he would be avoiding her presence to maintain the fiction of his engagement to Lady Henrietta. The newspapers had indeed published notice of the betrothal, describing it in glowing terms as the union of two great families, and speculating about when the wedding might take place and where the couple might reside. Each mention was a small knife to Arabella's heart, yet she understood the necessity of the charade and took some cold comfort in knowing that Frederick's feelings were unchanged even if his circumstances were not. What she had not anticipated was how quickly Lord Bennet would move once he believed Frederick safely occupied elsewhere. The first indication came at a reception at Lady Tilney's townhouse, where Arabella found herself cornered near the refreshment table by a fair-haired gentleman whose smile did not reach his pale blue eyes. Lord Bennet was handsome in a dissipated way, with features that might have been classical had they not been marked by the signs of excessive living, faint lines of debauchery around his mouth, a slight puffiness beneath his eyes that spoke of too much wine and too little sleep, and a restlessness in his manner that suggested a man constantly seeking the next pleasure or profit. He had approached with all the appearance of casual politeness, commenting on the weather and the quality of Lady Tilney's refreshments, but his eyes had lingered on Arabella in a way that made her skin crawl. She had extricated herself as quickly as propriety allowed, pleading a need to join her mother, but not before she caught the flash of calculation in his expression, the way he watched her retreat with the focused intensity of a predator selecting prey. The second encounter had been at the theatre 3 nights later, where the Fairfax family had taken a box for a performance of Hamlet. During the interval, when Arabella had stepped into the corridor for a breath of air away from the stuffy confines of the box, she had found Lord Bennet materializing at her elbow as though he had been waiting for just such an opportunity. He had been more forward this time, complimenting her appearance with a familiarity that exceeded the bounds of their minimal acquaintance, and suggesting that perhaps they might take a turn in the lobby together. Arabella had refused as politely as she could manage, citing her mother's expectation of her return, but Bennet's hand had briefly touched her arm as she moved past him, a touch that felt more like a claim than a courtesy. Now, a week after the Vauxhall meeting and 10 days since Frederick's devastating announcement at the Whitmore ball, Arabella found herself at a garden party hosted by the gardeners at their estate in Richmond. It was a beautiful June afternoon, the kind that made London society forget the grime and noise of the city and remember why England's gardens were celebrated throughout the world. The Gardiner estate was modest by aristocratic standards, but beautifully maintained, with terraced gardens that descended toward the Thames, rose arbors heavy with blooms in every shade from palest pink to deepest crimson, and serpentine paths that wound through beds of lavender and jasmine. The party was a substantial affair, with perhaps 80 guests scattered across the lawns and gardens, taking tea at small tables set up beneath striped awnings, admiring the plantings, or strolling the paths in groups of 2 or 3. Arabella had come with her mother and sister, grateful for the opportunity to be out of doors after several days of rain had confined them to the house. She had worn a dress of sprigged muslin in pale yellow, one of her few truly pretty gowns, and had allowed Lydia to persuade her to wear her hair in a softer style than usual, with curls framing her face rather than pulled severely back. For a few hours, she had almost succeeded in relaxing her guard, in simply enjoying the sunshine and the perfume of roses and the pleasure of watching her sister flirt harmlessly with a young lieutenant of her acquaintance. It was therefore a shock when she rounded a bend in one of the garden paths, having separated from her family to admire a particularly fine specimen of climbing roses, and found Lord Bennet blocking her way. He stood at the entrance to a small rose arbour, a secluded spot where a curved bench sat surrounded by trellises heavy with blooms, and his positioning was clearly deliberate, preventing her from passing without either retreating obviously or brushing past him in a way that would require uncomfortable proximity. His smile as he saw her was sharp, predatory, nothing like the expression of a gentleman pleased to encounter a lady of his acquaintance. "Lady Arabella," he said, executing a bow that somehow managed to seem mocking rather than respectful. "How fortunate to find you alone. I have been hoping for an opportunity to speak with you privately." "I am not alone," Arabella replied, keeping her voice steady with effort. "My mother and sister are nearby, and I must return to them shortly." She moved as though to step around him, but he shifted smoothly to maintain his blocking position, still smiling that unpleasant smile. "Surely you can spare a few moments for conversation," he said, his tone suggesting that this was not really a request. "We have much to discuss, you and I. I cannot imagine what we might have to discuss, my lord," Arabella said, fighting to keep the tremor from her voice. "We are barely acquainted." His smile widened, and something cold moved in his pale eyes. "Are we not? And yet I feel I know you quite well, Lady Arabella. I know, for instance, that you attended the Vauxhall Gardens last Tuesday evening at twilight, alone, without chaperone or companion. That is a rather remarkable thing for a lady of quality to do, is it not?" The words hit Arabella like ice water. He had been watching her, had perhaps been following her. The implications were terrifying, but she forced herself to maintain her composure, to give no sign of the panic rising in her chest. "I have no idea what you mean," she said coolly. "You must be mistaken." "Must I?" Bennett took a step closer, crowding into her space in a way that was overtly threatening. "I think not. I have made it my business to learn a great deal about you, my dear Lady Arabella. Your habits, your movements, your associations. It is remarkable what one can discover with sufficient motivation." His hand shot out suddenly, gripping her arm above the elbow with a force that made her gasp. "You will find that I am not a man to be trifled with. I know you met someone in that maze, though I have not yet determined who, but it hardly matters. The fact of the meeting itself is enough to destroy your reputation if it became known. A lady of unblemished character does not steal away to Vauxhall at twilight for innocent purposes." Arabella tried to pull her arm free, but his grip only tightened, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to leave bruises. "Release me at once!" she demanded, no longer caring about keeping her voice low. "You are hurting me." "I will release you when you agree to hear my proposal," Bennett said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You have something I want, my dear. Land that will soon be very valuable indeed. And I have the means to ruin you completely. I suggest we come to an arrangement that benefits us both. Marriage to me will secure your reputation and provide your family with a connection to a title of some consequence. In return, I will gain access to property that is rightfully mine by marriage. It is a simple transaction, really." Arabella felt true fear then, looking into eyes that held no warmth, no humanity, only cold calculation and the desperate determination of a man with nothing left to lose. She opened her mouth to scream, "Propriety be damned!" But before she could make a sound, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Lord Bennett, I believe you are wanted in the main garden. My father was asking after you." The voice was female, cool and aristocratic, utterly composed, and it belonged to the last person Arabella would have expected to come to her aid. Lady Henrietta Dashwood stood at the entrance to the rose arbour, resplendent in a gown of ice-blue silk that matched her eyes, her expression one of polite disdain as she regarded the scene before her. Her gaze took in Bennett's grip on Arabella's arm, the proximity of their bodies, and the fear in Arabella's face, and something flickered in those cool blue eyes, something that might have been anger, though her voice remained perfectly modulated. Lord Bennett released Arabella's arm so quickly she nearly stumbled, stepping back with a smoothness that suggested long practice at extricating himself from compromising situations. "Lady Henrietta," he said, his tone shifting to one of false geniality, "I was not aware Lord Pemberton was in attendance today." "He is not," Henrietta replied, her voice carrying a subtle edge that made the words a dismissal rather than a statement. "I merely wished to interrupt what appeared to be an uncomfortable conversation. Lady Fairfax looks quite distressed. Perhaps you might leave us, my lord. It is clear your presence is unwanted." For a moment, Bennett's mask slipped, and Arabella saw raw fury flash across his features before he controlled it. But he was not so far gone in desperation that he would openly defy the daughter of one of England's most powerful earls, particularly not when that daughter was engaged to a duke. He executed another of his mocking bows, this one directed at both ladies, and smiled with all the warmth of a snake. "Of course, please forgive any distress I may have inadvertently caused. Lady Fairfax and I were merely discussing matters of mutual interest, but the conversation can certainly be continued at another time." He walked past Henrietta without waiting for a response, his shoulder brushing hers in a gesture that was just shy of openly rude, and disappeared down the garden path toward the main party. Arabella sagged against the trellis, her legs suddenly unreliable, her arm throbbing where Bennett's fingers had gripped. Henrietta watched until the man was out of sight before turning back to Arabella, her expression shifting from aristocratic disdain to something more complex, something that might have been sympathy mixed with calculation. "Walk with me, Lady Fairfax," she said, offering her arm in a gesture that was both support and command. "We have much to discuss, you and I think it best we do so somewhere less exposed than a rose arbor, where anyone might stumble upon us." Arabella accepted the offered arm more from necessity than choice, still too shaken by the encounter with Bennet to fully process the strangeness of receiving aid from her rival, if rival was even the correct term for the woman engaged to the man Arabella loved. They walked in silence for several minutes, Henrietta guiding them along paths that led away from the main gathering toward a more secluded section of the garden, where a small gazebo overlooked the river. The structure was octagonal, built of white-painted wood with latticed sides that provided privacy while allowing air and light to filter through. Henrietta led, Arabella inside, and gestured for her to sit on one of the cushioned benches that lined the interior. Once they were both seated, Henrietta studied Arabella with those cool blue eyes, her expression unreadable. Finally she spoke, and her words were nothing Arabella could have anticipated. "Frederick told you of the arrangement, I presume, about why our engagement was announced so publicly and so suddenly." Arabella stared at her, unable to formulate a response. Henrietta's mouth curved in what might have been amusement. "I see that he did." "Good. That will make this conversation considerably easier. You need not look so shocked, Lady Fairfax. Did you think I was ignorant of the Duke's true feelings, that I believed his protestations of regard when he proposed an engagement of convenience?" Arabella found her voice, though it came out shakier than she would have liked. "He told me that you understood the arrangement, that it was mutually beneficial, but I did not realize you knew about me, about his feelings for you." Henrietta supplied calmly. "Of course I know. A woman would have to be blind not to see how he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching, how his attention follows you across every ballroom, how he seeks your conversation above all others. I have known Frederick since childhood, Lady Fairfax. Our families have been connected for generations. I know him well enough to recognize when his heart is engaged, and it has been engaged with you for quite some time." "Then why?" Arabella began, then stopped, unsure how to phrase the question without giving offense. "Why agree to an engagement to a man whose heart belongs to another?" Henrietta finished for her. "The answer is quite simple, because it suits my purposes as well as his." She smoothed her skirts with elegant fingers, her manner matter-of-fact, as though they were discussing the weather rather than matters of the heart. "My father, the Earl of Pemberton, is a man of great ambition and very little patience. He has determined that I should make a brilliant match, preferably to a duke, and he is not a man who accepts refusal gracefully. For the past 3 seasons, he has paraded me before every eligible peer in England, growing increasingly insistent that I secure a title of sufficient consequence." The pressure had become intolerable. Arabella was beginning to understand. "So when Frederick proposed this arrangement, it freed you from your father's demands?" "Precisely," Henrietta confirmed. "I gain the title and position my father requires without the burden of a husband who would expect romantic devotion I cannot provide. Frederick gains a screen for his true feelings and a reason to be seen as occupied so that Lord Bennet does not perceive him as competition for your hand. It is a practical solution to multiple problems." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "Or it would be, if Bennet were merely the dissolute fortune hunter Frederick believes him to be. But I fear the situation is more dangerous than either of you realize." Arabella leaned forward, her earlier fear returning. "What do you mean? What do you know of Lord Bennet?" "More than I should," Henrietta said grimly. "My father moves in political circles where information is currency, and I have learned over the years to listen at doors and read documents left carelessly on desks. Lord Bennet is not simply in debt, Lady Fairfax. He is ruined utterly and completely. He owes money to some of the most dangerous men in London, men who do not accept excuses or delays, men who have been known to arrange accidents for those who cannot pay. His creditors have given him until the end of summer to settle his debts, or face consequences that would make social disgrace seem trivial by comparison. Arabella felt cold despite the warmth of the June afternoon. And my land is his solution. The railway company's payment would be enough to save him. It would be enough to keep him alive. Henrietta corrected, which makes him far more dangerous than a mere fortune hunter. A man facing financial ruin might be deterred by scandal or social pressure. A man facing death will stop at nothing. She turned to face Arabella directly, and for the first time, genuine emotion showed in her cool features. He will try to force you into marriage, Lady Fairfax, and he will not be particular about his methods. The threat he made just now about ruining your reputation is only the beginning. If that fails, he will escalate. He might arrange a more serious compromise, one that cannot be explained away. He might even resort to abduction. Men in his position have done worse. Arabella's hand went to her throat, her mind reeling. Frederick said he would protect me, that the engagement to you would make Bennet believe he had no rival. That was the plan. Henrietta agreed. And it might have worked if Bennet were operating on a more leisurely timeline, but he is not. He grows more desperate by the day, and desperate men make reckless choices. The fact that he confronted you so boldly today, in a garden full of guests where anyone might have witnessed, suggests his desperation is overcoming his caution. She reached out and took Arabella's hand in hers, a gesture of unexpected solidarity. We must work together, you and I, to ensure Bennet cannot succeed. Frederick's plan is sound but incomplete. He thinks like a gentleman, assuming Bennet will behave according to certain rules. But men like Bennet acknowledge no rules when their survival is at stake. Arabella looked at this woman, this stranger who should have been her enemy, but was instead offering alliance, and felt a surge of confused gratitude. Why are you helping me? You could simply let Bennet succeed in his scheme. It would remove me from your path entirely. Henrietta's expression softened slightly, a hint of genuine warmth breaking through her usual cool composure. Because despite what you may think, I am not entirely heartless. I do not love Frederick, nor does he love me, but I respect him greatly. He is a good man, one of the few truly honorable men I have encountered in society. He deserves happiness, and his happiness clearly lies with you. She paused, her mouth curving in a slight smile. Besides, I have no patience for men like Bennet who think they can force women into submission through threats and violence. If I can play a role in thwarting his schemes, I shall take considerable satisfaction in doing so. What do you propose? Arabella asked, feeling a spark of hope for the first time since that terrible moment at the Whitmore ball. First, you must tell me everything Frederick told you about Bennet's plans, Henrietta said briskly. Then I will share what I know from my father's papers. Between us, we may be able to piece together enough information to anticipate Bennet's next move and counter it before he can act. For the next half hour, the two women sat in the gazebo and pooled their knowledge, Arabella recounting everything Frederick had revealed in the Vauxhall maze, Henrietta adding details she had gleaned from overheard conversations and documents she had seen in her father's study. A picture emerged of a man driven to increasingly reckless acts by mounting desperation, a man who had already made subtle inquiries about obtaining a special license for a hasty marriage, who had been seen in the company of men known for their willingness to arrange all manner of unsavory services for the right price, and who had apparently been watching Arabella's movements for weeks with the focused intensity of a man planning a campaign. By the time they had finished comparing information, both women were pale with the understanding of just how serious the threat actually was. Bennet was not simply hoping to compromise Arabella's reputation through rumors. He was planning something far more concrete, something that would make marriage to him seem not just advisable, but necessary. We must tell Frederick immediately, Arabella said, rising from the bench. He needs to know that the danger is more imminent than he believed. We will tell him. Henrietta agreed, also standing. But we must be careful how we communicate. If Bennet is watching you as closely as we suspect, any contact with Frederick could alert him to the fact that we are aware of his plans." She paused, thinking. "There is a ball at Devonshire House tomorrow night. Both you and Frederick will be in attendance, as will I. We can arrange a meeting there, somewhere private enough for conversation, but public enough that our gathering will not seem overtly suspicious. Until then, you must take every precaution. Do not go anywhere alone, not even in your own garden. Vary your routine so that Bennet cannot predict your movements. And if he approaches you again, make sure there are witnesses present." Arabella nodded, her mind already racing ahead to all the dangers she had been oblivious to until now. "Thank you, Lady Henrietta, for the warning and for the alliance. I know this cannot be easy for you." Henrietta's expression was unreadable. "You would be surprised what I find easy, Lady Fairfax. I have spent my entire life navigating the treacherous waters of society and managing the expectations of men who believe they have the right to control my choices. This is merely another challenge to be met and overcome." They walked back toward the main party in silence, but it was a companionable silence now, rather than the awkward tension of rivals. As they emerged onto the main lawn, Henrietta paused and turned to Arabella with a slight smile. "One more thing, Lady Fairfax. When this is over, when Bennet has been dealt with and you and Frederick are free to acknowledge your feelings openly, I expect to be invited to the wedding. It shall be small compensation for playing the role of abandoned fiancé, but I shall endeavour to appear appropriately heartbroken for the benefit of society." Despite everything, despite the fear and the danger and the impossible tangle of circumstances, Arabella found herself smiling back. "You shall have a place of honour, Lady Henrietta. I give you my word." "Good," Henrietta replied. "Now, let us return you to your mother before your absence is noted and provides more fodder for gossip." As they rejoined the party, Arabella caught sight of Lord Bennet watching them from across the lawn, his expression calculating and cold. But now, instead of facing the threat alone with only Frederick's distant protection, she had an unexpected ally, one who understood the rules of society and the ways of dangerous men, and who had her own reasons for wanting to see Bennet's schemes fail. The game had become more complex, the stakes higher, but for the first time since that night at Vauxhall, Arabella felt something other than helpless fear. She felt the beginning of hope, and the determination to fight for the future she wanted, rather than accept the one being forced upon her. Tomorrow night at Devonshire House, they would formulate a plan. Together the three of them would find a way to defeat Lord Bennet and his machinations. And perhaps, just perhaps, there might be a path forward that led to happiness rather than sacrifice, to love acknowledged rather than hidden, to a future that belonged to them rather than to duty and circumstance. The Rose Arbor encounter had been terrifying, but it had also brought an unexpected gift in the form of Henrietta's alliance. Sometimes, Arabella reflected as she rejoined her family, and tried to focus on the mundane pleasantries of a garden party. Sometimes the most unlikely allies were the ones who understood the battle best. And in Lady Henrietta Dashwood, she had found not a rival but a fellow strategist, a woman who played the game of society with skill and determination, and who had chosen to deploy those skills in service of love rather than against it. The ball at Devonshire House the previous evening had allowed Frederick, Henrietta, and Arabella to meet briefly in the conservatory, ostensibly to admire the exotic orchids, while in reality sharing intelligence and formulating their defence against Lord Bennet's inevitable escalation. Frederick had listened with growing alarm as Henrietta detailed the extent of Bennet's desperation, his jaw tightening when Arabella described the encounter in the Gardiner Rose Arbor and the bruises that still marked her arm beneath her long gloves. His instinct had been to confront Bennet directly, to use his considerable power and influence to crush the man completely. But both women had persuaded him that such an approach would only drive Bennet to act more recklessly and quickly. Instead, they had agreed to remain vigilant, to never allow Arabella to be alone or vulnerable, and to watch for the trap they all knew was coming. What none of them had anticipated was how soon it would spring, or how public Bennet would make his final gambit. The Tilney soirée 3 nights later was meant to be an intimate gathering, a musical followed by supper for perhaps 60 guests, the sort of refined entertainment that marked the latter part of the London season, when the truly fashionable families began to drift toward their country estates. Arabella had attended with her mother and sister, wearing a gown of rose silk that Lydia had insisted brought out the warmth in her complexion, her dark hair arranged in an elegant style that made her look older than her 23 years. She had been cautious all evening, keeping close to her family or to groups of acquaintances, acutely aware of Lord Bennet's presence across the drawing-room, where he stood in conversation with several other gentlemen, his pale eyes tracking her movements with predatory focus. Frederick was also present, arrived late with Lady Henrietta on his arm, and though he did not approach Arabella directly, she felt the comfort of his presence like a shield, knowing he was watching over her even from a distance. The musicale portion of the evening had concluded with a performance by a celebrated soprano imported from Milan at great expense, and the guests had begun to move toward the dining room, where supper was laid out on long tables draped in damask. It was during this transitional period, when the assembly was dispersed and distracted, that Arabella received the note. A footman had approached discreetly, offering a small folded paper on a silver salver, and Arabella had taken it automatically, assuming it to be some communication from her mother or perhaps an invitation to join a particular supper table. Instead, the message was unsigned and brief, claiming to be from Lady Henrietta, and requesting that Arabella meet her in the library immediately regarding a matter of utmost urgency concerning their mutual friend. Arabella's first instinct was suspicion. The note seemed too convenient, too perfectly designed to separate her from the safety of the crowd. But the mention of their mutual friend, clearly, meaning Frederick, gave her pause. What if something had happened? What if Bennet had made some move against Frederick himself? What if Henrietta truly needed to speak with her urgently? She looked around for Henrietta, intending to verify the note's authenticity, but could not locate her in the crush of guests moving between rooms. Her mother was engaged in conversation with Lady Morland, and had not noticed Arabella's distraction. Lydia had disappeared somewhere with her lieutenant, likely stealing a moment of flirtation in some corner. Frederick she could not approach without raising eyebrows, particularly as he stood with a group of gentlemen discussing what appeared to be political matters. The library, Arabella knew, was just down the corridor from the main drawing-room, a journey of perhaps 30 seconds. Surely she could slip away briefly, verify whether Henrietta had actually sent the note, and return before her absence was noticed. It was a calculated risk, but the alternative, ignoring a potentially genuine warning about danger to Frederick, seemed worse. She made her decision and moved as casually as she could manage toward the doorway, pausing to exchange a brief pleasantry with an acquaintance to establish that her departure appeared unhurried and innocent. The corridor outside the drawing-room was dimly lit, illuminated only by wall sconces placed at intervals, and the thick carpet muffled her footsteps as she walked toward the library door. She could hear the murmur of conversation and music fading behind her as she moved deeper into the quieter regions of the house, and a prickle of unease ran down her spine, even as she told herself she was being foolish. The library door was slightly ajar, a slice of lamplight spilling into the corridor, and Arabella pushed it open fully, expecting to find Henrietta waiting inside. Instead, the room appeared empty, a gentleman's domain of dark wood paneling, leather furniture, and walls lined floor to ceiling with books. A fire burned low in the grate, and several lamps had been lit, creating pools of golden light that left the corners in shadow. Arabella stepped inside, confused, looking around for any sign of Henrietta or any explanation for the summons. It was then that she heard voices in the corridor behind her, multiple voices approaching rapidly, and understanding hit her like a physical blow. She had been lured here. This was the trap. She spun toward the door, intending to leave immediately, but it was too late. Lord Bennet appeared in the doorway, blocking her exit, and behind him were at least 4 other gentlemen, their expressions a mixture of shock, curiosity, and in some cases barely concealed glee at having stumbled upon a scandal. "Lady Fairfax," Bennet said loudly, his voice carrying back toward the main rooms where other guests would surely hear. "How unexpected to find you here alone. I had understood you to be a lady of impeccable virtue, yet here you are, secreted away in a private room during a social gathering." The implications were clear and devastating. A lady discovered alone in a private room could claim innocent confusion. A lady discovered alone with a gentleman, or worse, appearing to be waiting for one, faced ruin. Arabella's mind raced frantically, searching for an explanation that would not sound like a desperate lie. "I received a note," she began, then stopped, realizing how pathetic it sounded. "A note asking me to meet someone here regarding an urgent matter." Bennet's smile was triumphant. "A note? How very convenient. And who, pray tell, were you meant to be meeting in this clandestine fashion?" Before Arabella could formulate an answer, before the full weight of the disaster could settle upon her, the door to an adjoining room opened, one Arabella had not even noticed in her panic, and two figures emerged into the library. Frederick and Henrietta stepped through the connecting doorway with perfect composure, as though it were entirely natural for them to be sequestered together in a private room adjoining the library. They were not touching, not arranged in any way that suggested impropriety, but their presence together in such intimate circumstances would itself have been scandalous had they not been engaged. Frederick held a book in his hands, and Henrietta carried what appeared to be a miniature painting, both items clearly selected from the room they had just exited, which Arabella now realized must be some sort of study or sitting room. "Bennet," Frederick said coolly, his pale eyes taking in the scene with a glance that missed nothing, the Earl's son blocking Arabella's exit. The group of men crowded behind him, the calculation and fury barely concealed on Bennet's face. "How unexpected to find you here. I was not aware you were invited to this gathering." "Lord Tilney is an old friend," Bennet replied, his smooth tone not quite concealing his frustration at finding his trap sprung differently than planned. "I might ask what brings your grace to this section of the house, away from the other guests and in the company of your fiancée." "Hardly scandalous for an engaged couple to seek a few moments of privacy," Frederick replied with aristocratic disdain. "Lady Henrietta wished to show me a particular miniature that Lord Tilney keeps in his private collection, a portrait by Hilliard that she thought might interest me given my own collection of such works." He gestured with the book he held, and I was consulting this volume on Elizabethan art to verify the attribution. All perfectly innocent and easily explained. His gaze moved to Arabella, who stood frozen across the room, her hands clutching the back of a leather chair for support. "Lady Fairfax, I presume you were also drawn by interest in Lord Tilney's collection?" The question was delivered smoothly, providing her with an explanation, an escape from Bennet's trap. But Arabella's mind was still reeling, trying to understand how Frederick and Henrietta had known to be here, how they had anticipated Bennet's move so precisely. "I received a note," she said slowly, deciding that truth was safer than invention. "A note claiming to be from Lady Henrietta, requesting I meet her here regarding an urgent matter. When I arrived, the room appeared empty." "I see," Henrietta said, her voice cool and controlled. "How very peculiar. I sent no such note, Lady Fairfax. It would appear someone has been playing games with both our reputations." She turned to Bennet with an expression of arctic disdain. "How fortunate that the Duke and I happened to be nearby, else poor Lady Fairfax might have been compromised by this mysterious summons. One might almost think the note was designed to create exactly such a scandal." Bennet's face had gone white with fury, his carefully constructed trap dismantled before his eyes. But he was not yet defeated. His mind worked visibly, searching for an angle, a way to salvage something from the wreckage of his plan, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of desperation disguised as righteous indignation. "How very convenient," he said, his words dripping with false concern, that your Grace and your fiancé should be positioned so perfectly to rescue Lady Fairfax from a compromising situation. One might almost wonder if the entire scenario was arranged, if perhaps Lady Fairfax's presence here was not quite as innocent as it appears. He stepped into the library fully, forcing the other gentlemen to follow or be left in the corridor. Are we to believe that Lady Fairfax simply wandered into this room by chance at the precise moment you and Lady Henrietta were examining Lord Tilney's collection? Or is there perhaps a more interesting explanation, one that involves secret assignations and clandestine meetings? The accusation hung in the air, ugly and dangerous, and Arabella saw several of the gentlemen behind Bennet exchanging glances, their expressions shifting from shock to speculation. Bennet was attempting to turn the situation around, to suggest that she and Frederick had been meeting secretly, that Henrietta's presence was some sort of elaborate cover for an affair. It was a desperate gambit, but desperation made it no less dangerous. Frederick's expression went cold, colder than Arabella had ever seen it, and when he spoke his voice carried the full weight of his rank and authority. You will withdraw that implication immediately, Bennet, or you will answer to me for it. To suggest that a lady of quality would engage in such behavior is beyond the bounds of acceptable discourse. I demand you apologize to Lady Fairfax at once. But Bennet had clearly decided to stake everything on this final throw of the dice. His creditors were closing in, his time was running out, and if he could not have Arabella's land through marriage, he would at least have the satisfaction of destroying those who had thwarted him. He laughed, a harsh sound without humor. An apology? From me? I think not, Your Grace. You demand satisfaction for an insult to Lady Fairfax's honor, yet where was your concern for honor when you were carrying her unconscious form from the Whitmore ballroom? When you were kneeling at her side with an intimacy that far exceeded what propriety allows? When you have been observed watching her at every social gathering with an attention that suggests far more than casual acquaintance? He turned to address the other gentleman, playing to his audience. I put it to you, sirs, that the Duke of Claiborne has been trifling with Lady Fairfax while publicly engaged to Lady Henrietta Dashwood. That this engagement is nothing more than a screen for an inappropriate attachment. That Lady Fairfax's presence here tonight was by design, not accident, part of a pattern of secret meetings that has been ongoing for months. The drawing-room had fallen silent, and Arabella realized with horror that more people were gathering in the corridor, drawn by the raised voices and the promise of scandal. Among them she saw her mother, her face pale with shock, and Lady Tilney, the hostess, looking appalled that such a scene was unfolding in her home. Bennet pressed his advantage, his voice rising. I have witnesses who can testify to Lady Fairfax's presence at Vauxhall Gardens at twilight without chaperone. I have testimony that she and the Duke have been conducting a clandestine correspondence. I have evidence of meetings in public places where they believed themselves unobserved. He turned back to Frederick, his expression triumphant despite the madness of what he was doing, destroying his own reputation in society even as he attempted to destroy theirs. So I ask you, Your Grace, which lady has claim to your honor? The one you are publicly engaged to, or the one you have been secretly pursuing? Will you defend Lady Fairfax and admit your engagement to Lady Henrietta is a sham, or will you maintain the fiction and allow Lady Fairfax's reputation to be destroyed? The choice is yours, but you cannot protect them both. The room seemed to hold its breath, every eye fixed on Frederick, whose face had gone rigid with suppressed emotion. Arabella could see the calculation in his eyes, the rapid assessment of options, the impossible position Bennet had created. If Frederick defended her too vigorously, he would be admitting to an inappropriate attachment while engaged to another woman, destroying both his honor and Henrietta's reputation. If he maintained the fiction of his engagement and treated Arabella as merely a casual acquaintance, her reputation would be shredded by Bennet's accusations and innuendo. There was no good choice, no path forward that did not sacrifice someone. Arabella watched emotions flicker across Frederick's face, saw the moment his composure began to crack, saw him drawing breath to speak words that would probably destroy the careful fiction they had constructed. And in that instant, she knew what she had to do. She stepped forward, moving, to the center of the library, where everyone could see her clearly, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, utterly composed despite the terror churning in her stomach. "Lord Bennet's accusations are both slanderous and absurd," she said clearly. "The Duke of Claiborne has never behaved toward me with anything other than the courtesy due any lady of his acquaintance. His engagement to Lady Henrietta is perfectly genuine, as anyone with eyes can see. As for my presence at Vauxhall Gardens, I was there as companion to my elderly aunt, Mrs. Beatrice Morland, who resides in Hampstead and who enjoys the gardens on fine evenings." She paused, letting the lie settle, knowing it could be verified or disproved, but gambling that Bennet had no actual witnesses, only supposition and speculation. However, Lord Bennet's interest in my movements and his attempts to manufacture scandal where none exists have made me most uncomfortable. Therefore, I have decided to accept my aunt's long-standing invitation to serve as her companion at her estate in Scotland. I will be departing London within the week and do not anticipate returning for the foreseeable future." The gasps that greeted this announcement were audible even over the murmur of speculation, and Arabella saw her mother's face drain of all colour, saw Lydia's expression of complete shock, saw Lady Tilney's relief that the scandal was resolving itself in a way that required no action on her part. But it was Frederick's reaction that nearly broke her resolve. His face went absolutely white, all his aristocratic composure shattering in an instant as the implications of her words sank in. She was removing herself from London, from society, from any possibility of marriage to him or to anyone. She was sacrificing her entire future to protect both his reputation and her own, choosing exile over scandal, choosing to preserve what they had built even if it meant destroying any chance of happiness. "No," he said, the single word escaping before he could stop it, raw and anguished. "Lady Fairfax, you cannot, that is, there is no need for such drastic measures." Henrietta placed a hand on his arm, a gesture that appeared supportive, but was clearly meant to restrain him from saying more, from revealing too much. "The Duke is quite right," she said smoothly, her cool voice a counterpoint to Frederick's emotion. "Surely such an extreme step is unnecessary, Lady Fairfax. Lord Bennet's wild accusations have no foundation, as everyone present can surely see. To leave London over such nonsense would be to give them credence they do not deserve." But Arabella shook her head, her eyes meeting Frederick's for just a moment, trying to convey in that brief glance all the love and regret and desperate hope that she could not speak aloud. "My decision is made, Lady Henrietta, though I thank you for your concern. My aunt grows elderly and has need of a companion. It is a respectable position, one that will suit me well." She turned to face Bennet directly, and allowed a note of steel to enter her voice. "As for Lord Bennet's insinuations, I trust that with my departure from London, his interest in my activities will cease. If it does not, I shall be forced to bring formal charges of harassment and slander, which I am certain my cousin, the magistrate in Derbyshire, would be most interested to investigate." The threat was subtle but clear, a reminder that even a lady of modest means had connections and recourse, and she saw Bennet's expression shift from triumph to frustrated rage. He had failed. She was escaping his reach, removing herself from London and from any possibility that he could force her into marriage. Without her presence in society, his accusations meant nothing, would be dismissed as the ravings of a desperate man attacking a lady who had already withdrawn from the field. One of the gentlemen behind Bennet, Lord Gardiner, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I believe this matter is concluded," he said firmly. "Lady Fairfax has explained her presence here satisfactorily. The Duke and Lady Henrietta have demonstrated the innocence of their own situation, and Lady Fairfax's decision to accept a position with her aunt is entirely her own affair." Bennet, I suggest you withdraw your accusations before you find yourself facing challenges from every gentleman present for your slander of ladies under our protection." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled men, and Arabella saw Bennet's face contort with impotent fury. He had overplayed his hand, had made his desperation too obvious, and now found himself facing social censure instead of the triumph he had anticipated. Without another word, he turned and pushed through the crowd, disappearing down the corridor like a beaten dog slinking away from a fight. The other guests began to disperse, the crisis resolved, if not forgotten, already composing the stories they would tell of this evening's drama. Lady Tilney approached Arabella with a concerned expression, murmuring something about the strain of the season and how a rest in Scotland might indeed be beneficial, while Arabella's mother appeared at her elbow, her face stricken, questions tumbling from her lips. Through it all, Arabella was aware of Frederick standing motionless in the centre of the library, his face a mask of anguish, his hands clenched at his sides as though it took every ounce of his control not to cross the room and pull her into his arms before all of London society. Henrietta remained beside him, her hand still on his arm, her expression unreadable, and Arabella wondered what the other woman was thinking, whether she approved of Arabella's sacrifice or thought it unnecessary, whether she would help Frederick recover from this blow or would simply proceed with their arranged marriage as though nothing had changed. As her mother led her from the library, Arabella allowed herself one final glance back, and her eyes met Frederick's across the crowded room. In that look she tried to convey everything she could not say, that she loved him, that this sacrifice was freely given, that she hoped someday they might find a way back to each other, that she would wait however long it took. His expression crumpled for just an instant before he regained control, and she saw his lips form two silent words that she understood perfectly even across the distance. "Forgive me." Then she was swept into the corridor and surrounded by concerned acquaintances and her distressed family, and the library with its leather chairs and flickering lamplight, and the man she loved disappeared from view. The carriage ride home was a blur of her mother's anxious questions and Lydia's shocked exclamations, neither of which Arabella could properly answer without revealing truths that must remain hidden. She pleaded exhaustion and shock, promised explanations in the morning, and retreated to her chamber as soon as they arrived home, closing the door against the world, and finally allowing the tears she had held back to fall. She had saved Frederick's honour and her own reputation, had thwarted Bennet's scheme and removed herself from his reach, but the cost was everything she had ever wanted. Scotland was not exile, not truly, but it might as well have been. Her aunt's estate was remote, far from London society, far from any possibility of seeing Frederick, of being part of his life in even the most tangential way. She would be burying herself alive to protect a love that now seemed more impossible than ever, sacrificing her future on the altar of propriety and protection. Yet even through her grief, even through the tears that soaked her pillow as she lay in the darkness, Arabella could not regret her choice. She had seen Frederick's face, had seen the moment he was about to sacrifice everything for her, and she could not allow him to destroy himself. Better that she should disappear, should fade into obscurity as a spinster companion to an elderly aunt, than that he should lose his position, his honour, his ability to protect others who might need him. Love, she was learning, was not always about claiming what you wanted. Sometimes it was about protecting what you loved, even at the cost of your own happiness. And so she would go to Scotland and try to build a life from the ruins of her dreams, carrying with her the memory of twilight in a maze, of a kiss that should never have happened, of words whispered in a library that no one else had heard. She would go, and she would survive, and she would hope that someday, somehow, fate might be kinder than it had been tonight. The rain began just after sunset on the evening before Arabella's scheduled departure for Scotland, a summer storm that swept across London with unexpected ferocity, turning the streets into rivers and hammering against window panes with a violence that matched the turmoil in her heart. She sat in the small parlour of the Bloomsbury townhouse, surrounded by half-packed trunks and scattered belongings, the physical manifestation of a life being dismantled, and tried to convince herself that she was doing the right thing. 4 days had passed since the disastrous scene at the Tilney soirée. 4 days during which Arabella had thrown herself into preparations for departure with a manic energy that kept her too busy to think, too occupied to feel. Her mother had wept and pleaded, unable to understand why her daughter would choose to bury herself in the Scottish Highlands as companion to an elderly aunt she had met only twice in her life. Lydia had railed against the injustice of it all, declaring that Arabella was being driven away by that horrid Lord Bennet, and that someone should call him out for his behaviour. Neither woman knew the full truth, and Arabella could not enlighten them without revealing Frederick's involvement, without exposing the love that had driven all her choices. So she had simply insisted that the decision was made, that her aunt needed her, that a change of scenery would do her good after the strain of the season. Now, on her last night in London, perhaps her last night in this city forever, Arabella sat among the detritus of her former life and allowed herself to acknowledge the full weight of her grief. Tomorrow she would board a coach that would carry her north, away from everything familiar, away from the slim hope that she might catch a glimpse of Frederick at some social gathering, away from the possibility, however remote, that circumstances might change, and their love might find a way forward. Tonight she could mourn what she was leaving behind, could allow the tears that had been threatening for days to finally fall unchecked. She wore a simple dress of grey wool, practical clothing for travelling, and her hair hung loose down her back rather than arranged in the elaborate styles society demanded. There seemed little point in maintaining such pretenses when tomorrow would see her transformed from a lady of quality, however modest, into a mere companion, a woman whose consequence derived entirely from her employer rather than her own birth or connections. The clock on the mantel, one of the few valuable items that would not be packed, as the house would remain occupied by her mother and sister, chimed 8 times, each note seeming to mark another door closing, another possibility ending. Arabella wiped her eyes with a handkerchief already damp from previous tears and tried to focus on the practical task of deciding which books to take and which to leave behind. Her small allowance would not permit excessive baggage, and every item must be carefully considered. She was examining a volume of poetry, one Frederick had once mentioned admiring, trying to decide if keeping it would be a comfort or a torment, when she heard a commotion in the entrance hall below. Raised voices, her mother's tone of shock and confusion, and then footsteps on the stairs, rapid and heavy, the tread of someone taking them 2 at a time. Before Arabella could rise from her seat, before she could compose herself or hide the evidence of her tears, the parlour door burst open and Frederick stood on the threshold, and the sight of him drove all coherent thought from her mind. He was soaked to the skin, his coat and breeches dark with rain, his cravat loosened and askew, his carefully styled hair plastered to his head and dripping water onto the carpet. He looked nothing like the composed Duke of Claiborne, who moved through society with such assured authority, and everything like a man who had abandoned all pretense of propriety in desperate urgency. His chest heaved as though he had been running, and his pale eyes blazed with an intensity that made Arabella's breath catch even through her shock at his appearance. Behind him hovered Jenny, the young maid, her expression torn between scandal at allowing a gentleman into the parlour with her mistress unchaperoned, and awe at having a duke standing in their modest entrance hall. Mrs. Fairfax could be heard calling questions from below, her voice sharp with confusion and the beginning of alarm. But Frederick seemed oblivious to everything except the woman seated among the trunks, her face wet with tears, her composure shattered. "I tried to tell him you were not receiving visitors, my lady," Jenny stammered, wringing her hands. "But his grace insisted it was urgent, and I did not know what to do, and he just came up the stairs before I could stop him." "It is all right, Jenny," Arabella managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You may go." But Jenny hesitated, propriety warring with the unprecedented situation, until Frederick turned his compelling gaze on her and said quietly but with unmistakable authority, "Please leave us. What I have to say to Lady Fairfax cannot wait and cannot be overheard. Close the door behind you." The maid fled, pulling the door shut, and Arabella heard her hurrying down the stairs, no doubt to report this development to Mrs. Fairfax, and possibly to faint from the scandal of it all. For a long moment, Arabella and Frederick simply stared at each other across the cluttered parlour, the air between them crackling with everything unspoken, everything that had been building for 2 years and could no longer be contained. Finally, Arabella found her voice, though it came out shakier than she would have liked. "You should not be here, Frederick. If anyone sees you, if word gets out that you visited me alone in my home, both our reputations will be destroyed. Everything we have sacrificed will have been for nothing." Frederick took a step into the room, water dripping from his coat onto the worn carpet, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, as though he was fighting to keep them from reaching for her. "I do not care about my reputation," he said, his voice rough and raw. "I do not care about scandal or gossip or what society thinks. I cannot let you go like this, Arabella. I cannot let you disappear into Scotland believing that I chose duty over you, that I chose Henrietta, that I chose anything other than you from the moment I first knew you." Arabella rose from her chair, her legs unsteady, her whole body trembling with the effort of maintaining any control at all. "You announced your engagement to her before hundreds of witnesses," she said, and heard the bitterness in her own voice. "You stood on that dais and proclaimed to all of London that she would be your Duchess. How is that not choosing her?" "Because the engagement was never real," Frederick said, taking another step closer. "It was never legally binding. There was no formal contract, no settlement signed, no banns read. It was a performance, Arabella, a piece of theatre designed to protect you from Bennet by making it appear I was safely occupied elsewhere. Henrietta knew it, I knew it, and we both agreed that when the danger had passed, the engagement would be quietly dissolved and we would both be free to pursue our own paths." "But you announced it so publicly," Arabella protested, even as hope began to war with despair in her chest. "You stood before all of society and declared your intentions. How could such an announcement not be binding?" "Because I was careful with my words," Frederick replied. "I announced that I intended to form an alliance with the Dashwood family, that Lady Henrietta and I had reached an understanding. I never spoke vows, never made promises that could be held legally binding. It was all deliberate ambiguity, enough to convince society and therefore to convince Bennet, but nothing that would actually trap either Henrietta or myself in an unwanted marriage." He ran a hand through his wet hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "But I see now that my elaborate schemes, my careful plans to protect you from a distance, have done nothing but cause you pain. I thought I was being noble, sacrificing my own happiness to keep you safe. But all I have done is drive you away. I have been a fool, Arabella. A blind, arrogant fool who was so focused on protecting you from external threats that I never considered I might be the one hurting you most." The words hung in the air between them, and Arabella felt something crack inside her chest, some barrier she had been maintaining to keep her heart from shattering completely. "You told me your happiness was decided 2 years ago," she said, her voice breaking. "You told me in the maze at Vauxhall that you had been mine from the moment I laughed at your terrible poetry. But then you bound yourself to Henrietta, and you avoided me at every gathering, and you let me believe that duty and honour mattered more to you than whatever we might have had together. How was I supposed to interpret that except as rejection?" Frederick's expression twisted with anguish, and he closed the remaining distance between them in 3 long strides, his hands reaching for hers, gripping them with a desperate strength. "I chose you, Arabella. I have always chosen you. Every decision I have made for the past 2 years has been about you, about keeping you safe, about trying to create a world where you could be happy, even if that happiness did not include me. When I learned of Bennett's scheme, when I realized the danger you faced, I would have done anything to protect you. If that meant announcing an engagement to another woman, I would do it. If that meant staying away from you, even when every fiber of my being wanted to be near you, I would do it. If that meant watching you from across ballrooms and aching with the need to dance with you, to talk with you, to simply be in your presence, I would endure it all gladly if it meant you were safe. His pale eyes searched her face, and she saw in them a vulnerability she had never witnessed before, a rawness that stripped away all his ducal armor. But I see now that I was wrong. I was so focused on protecting you from Bennett, from scandal, from anything that might harm you, that I never asked what you actually wanted. I never fought for us, only against him. I never gave you the choice to face the danger together, to be partners in finding solutions, rather than casting you as something fragile that needed to be shielded and hidden away. Arabella's tears were falling freely now, but they were different tears than before, tears of relief and heartbreak and desperate hope all mingled together. "I thought you did not want me," she whispered. "I thought I was convenient to protect because you are a good man who would help anyone in need, but that your heart was never truly engaged. Even when you kissed me in the maze, even when you told me you loved me, I thought it was a moment of weakness, something you regretted." Frederick made a sound that was half laugh, half groan, and released one of her hands to cup her face, his thumb brushing away her tears with infinite gentleness. "Regret kissing you? Arabella, that kiss was the only real, honest, unguarded moment I have allowed myself in 2 years of loving you. Everything else has been strategy and schemes and careful maneuvering. But that kiss was pure truth. I have thought of nothing else since, have dreamed of it every night, have wished desperately that I could have more than one stolen moment in a mist-filled maze. But I would not," she began, then stopped, trying to organize thoughts that seemed to scatter like leaves in wind. "At the Tilney soiree, when Bennett challenged you, I saw your face. I saw you about to sacrifice everything, about to expose the false engagement and defend me at the cost of your own honor. I could not let you do it, Frederick. I could not let you destroy yourself for my sake. So you sacrificed yourself instead," Frederick said, his voice rough with emotion. "You exiled yourself to Scotland, gave up your life in London, your connections, your chances of marriage and happiness, all to protect me from the consequences of my own choices." His other hand came up to frame, her face completely, holding her as though she were something infinitely precious and fragile. "Do you have any idea what it did to me, watching you announce your departure, seeing you walk away and knowing you were doing it for me, because of me? I have spent 4 days in absolute torment, trying to respect your decision, trying to tell myself that you had chosen this path and I should honor it, but I cannot. I cannot let you go to Scotland believing that I chose anything other than you, that I want anything other than a life with you." "But Bennett," Arabella started, and Frederick shook his head. "Bennett is gone. He fled London 2 nights ago, 1 step ahead of his creditors and the bailiffs. I received word this morning that he took ship for the continent, likely France, where he will have to live on whatever he can scrape together from sympathetic relatives or gambling. He is ruined completely. His estates will be seized to pay his debts, and he will never set foot in England again without facing arrest. You are safe from him, Arabella. The threat is over." The relief that flooded through Arabella at those words was almost overwhelming, but close on its heels came confusion and a desperate need to understand. If Bennett is gone, if the danger has passed, then why are you here? Why now, on the eve of my departure, do you come to tell me this? Why not let me go if the purpose of all the schemes and sacrifices has been fulfilled? Because I realized something when I watched you walk out of that library at the Tilney soiree," Frederick said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, his forehead coming to rest against hers in a gesture of such intimacy it made her breath catch. I realized that I have been so focused on protecting you from Bennett, from scandal, from anything that might harm you, that I never once asked if you wanted to be protected. I never asked what you wanted, Arabella. I never gave you the choice to fight alongside me, to face the danger together, to decide for yourself what risks you were willing to take. I treated you like something to be guarded and preserved rather than as a partner, an equal, someone whose own wishes and desires mattered as much as my grand plans. I was so certain I knew what was best, so convinced that my schemes would solve everything, that I never stopped to consider the simplest solution of all. Arabella's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs, and when she spoke her voice trembled with the weight of hope and fear. What solution? Asking you what you want, Frederick said simply. Giving you the choice instead of making it for you. So I am here, drenched and improper and completely abandoning every rule of society, to ask you directly and honestly with no schemes or shadows between us. What do you want, Arabella? Do you want to go to Scotland and build a new life as your aunt's companion? If that is truly what will make you happy, I will let you go, and I will not interfere, though it will break my heart. Or do you want to stay? Do you want to let me court you properly, openly, the way I should have done 2 years ago? Do you want to give us a chance to see what we might become without secrets and elaborate plans and constant fear of discovery? The question hung in the air between them, and Arabella realized with sudden clarity that this was the first time anyone had truly asked her what she wanted, the first time her own desires had been centered in all the machinations and schemes that had defined her life for the past months. Frederick was giving her the choice, the power, the agency to decide her own future, and the magnitude of that gift was almost more than she could process. I want, she began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the rush of feelings, by the enormity of what was being offered. Frederick waited, patient despite the tension evident in every line of his body, despite the fact that water was still dripping from his coat onto the carpet, despite the impropriety of the situation and the risk he was taking by being here. He waited because he had asked, and he would accept whatever answer she gave, even if it destroyed him. I want you, Arabella finally said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I have wanted you from that night at the Moorland Musicale when you shared your poetry with me and looked embarrassed about its imperfections. I have wanted you through 2 seasons of watching you from across ballrooms and treasuring every conversation, every dance, every moment in your presence. I wanted you when you announced your engagement to Henrietta, and I thought my heart would shatter. I wanted you in the Vauxhall maze when you told me you loved me and then walked away. I have wanted you every single day since, even when I thought wanting you was hopeless, even when I believed you had chosen duty over love. She took a shaking breath, tears streaming down her face, but pressed on, needing him to hear all of it, to understand completely. I announced I was going to Scotland, not because I wanted to leave, but because I could not bear to watch you sacrifice yourself for me. I could not stand by and let you destroy your honor and position just to protect a woman of no particular consequence. But if you are truly free, if Henrietta was never a real obstacle, if Bennett is gone and the danger is past, then yes, Frederick. Yes, I want to stay. Yes, I want you to court me. Yes, I want everything you are offering and more besides. I want a life with you, a future with you, all the things I never dared hope for because they seemed so far beyond my reach. For a moment, Frederick simply stared at her, his expression transforming from desperate hope to blazing joy. And then he was pulling her against him, his arms coming around her with a fierce possessiveness that spoke of long denial finally breaking. His lips found hers in a kiss that was nothing like the careful, restrained caress they had shared in the Vauxhall maze. This was desperate and claiming and full of 2 years of pent-up longing, and Arabella responded with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his wet coat, her body molding to his as though they had been designed to fit together exactly this way. The kiss went on and on, neither of them willing to break contact, both trying to communicate through touch what words seemed inadequate to express. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Frederick kept her close, his forehead resting against hers, his arms still wrapped around her, as though he feared she might disappear if he loosened his hold. "Stay," he said again, the single word a plea and a prayer. "Stay and let me do this properly. Let me call on you tomorrow with your mother present. Let me bring you flowers and take you driving in the park and bore you with discussions of art and literature and all the mundane things that courting couples do. Let me show all of London that you are the woman I have chosen, that you are the only woman I have ever wanted, that everything else was merely me being spectacularly stupid about how to win you." Arabella laughed through her tears, joy bubbling up inside her with such force it was almost painful. "You were not stupid. You were trying to protect me from a very real threat. But perhaps next time you might consider simply talking to me about the danger, rather than constructing an elaborate fake engagement." Frederick groaned and pulled her closer. "There will be no next time. I have learned my lesson about grand schemes and noble sacrifices. From now on, we face everything together. As partners, with honesty and communication rather than secrets and strategies." He pulled back slightly to look at her face, his expression growing more serious. "But there is still the matter of propriety and your reputation. I have already scandalized your household by bursting in here like a madman. If I stay much longer, if anyone learns I was here alone with you, there will be talk." His mouth curved in a slight smile. "Though perhaps that would not be entirely terrible, as it would give me an excuse to insist on an immediate engagement to protect your honor." "You are incorrigible," Arabella said, but she was smiling through her tears. "And you are right that you should probably leave before my mother recovers from her shock and comes up here to demand explanations." "But Frederick," she grew serious again, gripping his lapels to keep him from pulling away. "What about Henrietta? Even if the engagement was never legally binding, she has been involved in this scheme from the beginning. We owe her the courtesy of speaking with her before we proceed." Frederick nodded, his expression softening. "I sent word to Henrietta before I came here tonight, telling her that I could not continue the charade any longer, that I was going to declare myself to you properly, and that if you accepted me, I would be making the truth of our non-engagement public immediately." She sent back a very terse note, congratulating me on finally developing some sense and informing me that she has her own interests to pursue, now that she is released from the obligation of pretending to be my fiancé. His smile turned wry. "I believe she may have been even more frustrated by my elaborate schemes than you were, though she was too polite to say so directly until now." "So she approves?" Arabella asked, relief flooding through her. "I would not want our happiness to come at the cost of hers." "Henrietta has never wanted me except as a shield from her father's demands," Frederick assured her. "And now that she has played the role of my fiancé long enough to establish her desirability in society's eyes, she is free to pursue the man she actually cares for, a gentleman of good family but insufficient rank to satisfy her father's ambitions. The false engagement served her purposes as well as mine, and she is more than happy to see it end now that those purposes have been fulfilled." He cupped Arabella's face again, his thumb stroking her cheek with infinite tenderness. "But enough talk of Henrietta and schemes and all the complicated tangles we have been living in. I need to know one more thing before I leave tonight and begin the proper courtship tomorrow." Arabella looked up at him, seeing in his pale eyes a vulnerability that made her heart ache. "What do you need to know?" "That you will not change your mind," Frederick said quietly. "That when I call tomorrow with flowers and declarations, when I present myself to your mother as a suitor, you will not have retreated behind walls again. That you truly want this, want me, not as some romantic notion, but as a real man with faults and foolishness and a tendency to make elaborate plans that go spectacularly wrong. She rose on her toes and kissed him softly, a gentle promise rather than the desperate claiming of moments before. "I want you exactly as you are," she whispered against his lips. "Foolish schemes and all. Though I reserve the right to tell you when your plans are becoming unnecessarily complicated, and to insist we simply talk about problems like sensible people." Frederick's laugh was warm and genuine, the sound filling the parlor and chasing away the last shadows of doubt and fear. "Then we have an understanding. Tomorrow I begin courting you properly. Within a fortnight I will ask for your hand. Within a month I will marry you if you will have me, because I have wasted 2 years already, and I am not inclined to waste another moment." He released her reluctantly, stepping back and toward the door, though his eyes never left her face. "Unpack your trunks, my love. You are not going to Scotland. You are staying right here in London where you belong, where I can see you every day, where I can prove to you that my love is not a scheme or a strategy, but the truest thing I have ever felt." Arabella watched him go, heard his footsteps on the stairs, heard the front door open and close, and then she was alone in the parlor again, surrounded by the half-packed trunks. But everything had changed. The trunks that had represented exile and sacrifice now represented merely an unnecessary precaution that could be undone. The tears on her face were tears of joy rather than grief. The future that had seemed so bleak and empty now blazed with possibility and promise. She moved to the window and looked out at the rain-soaked street, just in time to see Frederick emerge from the townhouse, still hatless, still drenched, utterly unconcerned with the storm or propriety or anything except the fact that he had declared himself and been accepted. He looked up at the window as though knowing she would be there, and even through the rain and the darkness she could see his smile, brilliant and unguarded, the smile of a man who had finally stopped trying to protect happiness from a distance and had instead chosen to claim it directly. She pressed her hand to the glass in a silent gesture of connection, and he raised his in response before turning and striding away into the rainy night. Arabella stood at the window long after he had disappeared, her heart so full it felt as though it might overflow, and began to plan not for departure, but for the future that now stretched before her bright with promise. Tomorrow Frederick would call, proper and correct with her mother present. Tomorrow the courtship would begin in earnest, open and acknowledged before all of London. Tomorrow the world would learn that the Duke of Claiborne had chosen a lady of modest fortune over political alliance and grand connections, had chosen love over strategy, had chosen Arabella Fairfax over everything else society valued. But tonight, in this quiet moment between one life and another, Arabella simply stood at the window and let herself feel the weight of 2 years of longing finally released, of love that had been hidden in shadows finally brought into the light, of a future that had seemed impossible now opening before her like a flower turning toward the sun. The rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean, and in the small Bloomsbury parlor, surrounded by trunks that would never make the journey to Scotland, Arabella began to believe in happy endings after all. The September evening was perfect, one of those rare gifts that England bestows occasionally when summer reluctantly yields to autumn, the air warm enough to be comfortable, yet touched with the crispness that promised cooler days ahead. The gardens of Claiborne House, Frederick's ducal estate in Kent, were ablaze with late blooming roses and dahlias, their colours seeming almost too vivid against the mellowing light of early evening. Inside the grand manor house, preparations had been underway all day for what Frederick insisted on calling an intimate gathering, though Arabella had laughed at the description given that intimate apparently meant 50 guests, including family, close friends, and those members of society whose good opinion actually mattered. 6 weeks had passed since that rain-soaked evening when Frederick had appeared at her Bloomsbury townhouse and shattered all her plans for Scottish exile. 6 weeks during which he had kept his promise to court her properly, despite his clear impatience with the slow pace propriety demanded. He had called every day that decency allowed, bringing flowers that progressed from tasteful bouquets to increasingly elaborate arrangements that made her mother's modest parlour look like a conservatory. He had taken Arabella driving in Hyde Park at the fashionable hour when all of society could observe them together, making it abundantly clear that his interest was serious and his intentions honourable. He had escorted her to the theatre, to musicales, to gallery exhibitions, and to every social gathering where their presence together would cement in the public mind that the Duke of Claiborne had eyes for no one but Lady Arabella Fairfax. The dissolution of his engagement to Lady Henrietta had been handled with such skill and discretion that society had barely blinked. Henrietta herself had announced, just 3 days after Frederick's midnight visit to Arabella, that upon reflection she and the Duke had determined they would not suit, that their attachment had been more a meeting of minds regarding family duty than a meeting of hearts, and that they had mutually agreed to end the engagement by common consent with no ill will on either side. The speed with which Viscount Sebastian Morland had then begun paying marked attention to Henrietta had led to some raised eyebrows and knowing smiles, but the general consensus seemed to be that both parties had made a fortunate escape and found more suitable attachments elsewhere. Frederick had proposed formally 1 month to the day after his rain-soaked confession, going down on one knee in her mother's parlour with Mrs. Fairfax and Lydia present as witnesses, presenting a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and making a speech about love and partnership, and choosing each other freely that had left all 3 Fairfax ladies in tears. Arabella had accepted with a joy so profound it felt almost painful, and the announcement in the morning papers 2 days later had been met with general approval from a society that loved a romantic story, and had apparently decided that the Duke's choice of a lady of modest fortune over grand political alliance was rather admirably sentimental. Now, 6 weeks after everything had changed, they were gathering at Claiborne House to celebrate their engagement formally among those who mattered most to them. Arabella stood in one of the guest chambers where she had been shown to prepare for the evening, examining her reflection in the full-length mirror with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. The woman who looked back at her seemed transformed from the modest lady who had attended the Whitmore ball in pale lavender just 3 months ago. Her gown tonight was a creation of deep, sapphire silk that brought out the golden warmth of her eyes, cut in the latest fashion with a fitted bodice and full skirts that rustled when she moved. Her dark hair had been dressed by Frederick's own lady's maid, arranged in an elaborate style with small sapphires woven through the curls that matched the stones in the necklace Frederick had presented to her that afternoon as an engagement gift. She looked, she had to admit, like a woman who belonged at a duke's side, like someone who had every right to be mistress of a grand estate and to move in the highest circles of society. The transformation was not merely external. Over the past 6 weeks, as Frederick had courted her openly and introduced her to his world, Arabella had discovered a confidence she had not known she possessed. She had learned that her intelligence and education, which she had always considered merely adequate, were actually exceptional by society's standards. She had found that her opinions on art and literature were valued by people whose judgment she respected. She had realized that the modest circumstances she had always viewed as a limitation had actually given her a perspective and empathy that many in Frederick's elevated circle lacked. Most importantly, she had learned what it meant to be loved not as an object to be protected, but as a partner to be cherished and consulted, and the knowledge had changed something fundamental in how she saw herself. A soft knock at the door preceded the entrance of Lady Henrietta Dashwood, resplendent in a gown of emerald green that complemented her fair colouring perfectly. The 2 women had developed an unexpected friendship over the past weeks, built on mutual respect and the shared understanding of what it meant to navigate society's expectations while trying to claim some measure of personal happiness. Henrietta's engagement to Viscount Morland had been announced just 2 weeks after Frederick's proposal to Arabella, and the genuine joy in her expression when she spoke of her intended made it clear that this was a love match rather than the strategic alliance her first engagement had been. "Are you ready?" Henrietta asked, crossing the room to stand beside Arabella at the mirror. "The guests are all assembled in the ballroom, and Frederick is pacing like a caged lion waiting for you to make your entrance. One would think after 6 weeks of daily courtship he might be less anxious, but apparently the man cannot bear to be separated from you for more than an hour." Arabella smiled at her reflection, at the happiness evident in her own face. "I am ready, though I confess I still sometimes cannot believe this is real, that I am actually going to marry Frederick, that all the schemes and shadows have resolved into something so straightforward and joyful." Henrietta's expression turned knowing. "It is real, I promise you, and you deserve every bit of the happiness you have found, as does Frederick." She paused, then added with characteristic directness, "I wanted to thank you, Arabella, before we go down to face the assembly." "Thank me?" Arabella turned from the mirror to face her friend directly. "For what?" "I should be thanking you for your role in bringing Frederick and me together, for agreeing to that false engagement that protected me from Bennett, for being willing to take on a role that must have been uncomfortable to help 2 people you barely knew." Henrietta shook her head, her smile slight but genuine. "I am not thanking you for anything you did consciously. I am thanking you for loving Frederick the way you do, for seeing past his title and his position to the man underneath, for valuing his heart over his consequences." She moved to adjust a curl that had escaped Arabella's elaborate coiffure, her touch gentle. "I have known Frederick since we were children, and I have watched him carry the weight of duty and responsibility without complaint for his entire adult life. He has always done what was expected, always chosen the path of greatest honor and least personal satisfaction. Watching him choose you, watching him finally put his own happiness first, has been one of the greatest privileges of my life. You have given him permission to be human rather than merely ducal, and for that, I am profoundly grateful." Arabella felt tears prick at her eyes, and blinked them back, not wanting to ruin the careful work the maid had done on her face. "You make it sound as though I have done something heroic, when in truth I have simply loved him. The most selfish, natural thing in the world. Sometimes the most natural things are also the most heroic," Henrietta replied. "Now, shall we go downstairs before Frederick wears a path in the ballroom floor with his pacing?" The 2 women descended the grand staircase together, a sight that would have seemed impossible just months ago, the current fiancé and the former one moving in perfect harmony. The ballroom at Claiborne House was magnificent, smaller than the grand assembly rooms at places like Whitmore or Devonshire, but no less impressive, for its more intimate scale. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over walls hung with silk in deep crimson and gold, and tall windows stood open to the gardens beyond, allowing the evening breeze to carry the scent of roses into the room. The guests assembled were indeed the people who mattered most: Frederick's sister and her husband, Arabella's mother and Lydia, looking slightly awed by their surroundings, several couples who had proven themselves true friends rather than merely social acquaintances, and a select group of family members on both sides. Viscount Morland stood near one of the windows, engaged in conversation with Frederick's brother-in-law, his eyes tracking Henrietta's entrance with an attention that made his feelings abundantly clear. But it was Frederick whom Arabella saw first and last, Frederick who stood near the center of the ballroom and turned as though sensing her presence, before she had even fully entered. He was devastating in his evening clothes, the severe black coat and white cravat emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders and the aristocratic perfection of his features. But it was his expression that made Arabella's breath catch. He looked at her as though she were the only person in the room, in the world, as though the sight of her descending those stairs was the answer to every prayer he had ever uttered. The naked love and pride in his face would have been shocking in its intensity had anyone been watching closely, but Frederick seemed to have forgotten entirely that they had an audience. He crossed the ballroom in long strides, propriety be damned, and met her at the base of the stairs, taking her hand and raising it to his lips in a gesture that was both courtly and intimate. "You are breathtaking," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "I knew the sapphires would suit you perfectly. They belonged to my grandmother, who was by all accounts a formidable woman, and I think she would have loved you as I do." Arabella smiled up at him, her heart so full she thought it might overflow. "You are somewhat breathtaking yourself, Your Grace. Though I think we are supposed to maintain at least the appearance of propriety until after the official announcement." Frederick's answering smile was wicked. "I have spent 6 weeks being excruciatingly proper, calling at prescribed hours, limiting our time alone together, submitting to your mother's chaperoning with saintly patience. Tonight is our engagement celebration, and I intend to hold you as close as society will permit, and perhaps slightly closer." His sister, the Duchess of Hartfield, called out from across the room with evident amusement. "Frederick, stop monopolizing your intended and bring her over so we can welcome her properly to the family." The evening that followed was unlike any Arabella had experienced in her 3 seasons in London society. There was no stiffness, no social maneuvering, no undercurrent of judgment or competition. The guests were genuinely pleased for them. The conversation was lively and intelligent, and when Frederick's brother-in-law proposed a toast to the happy couple, the good wishes expressed were heartfelt rather than merely polite. Dinner was served in the grand dining room, Arabella seated at Frederick's right as his acknowledged fiancée, and the meal was a succession of exquisite courses accompanied by excellent wine and better conversation. Henrietta, seated across from Arabella with Viscount Morland at her side, caught her eye several times during the meal and smiled in a way that seemed to say, "You see? This is what happiness looks like when it is freely chosen rather than strategically arranged." After dinner, the guests returned to the ballroom, where the small orchestra Frederick had engaged struck up a waltz. It was the same piece that had been playing at the Whitmore ball when Frederick had made his false announcement, and Arabella recognized it immediately, feeling a complex wash of emotions at the memory of that devastating night. Frederick noticed her reaction and drew her onto the floor, taking her in his arms with a possessiveness that would have raised eyebrows in more formal company, but here merely earned indulgent smiles from their friends. "No fainting this time, I hope?" Arabella teased as they began to move, falling easily into the rhythm of the dance. Frederick pulled her slightly closer than the prescribed 12 inches, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, close enough that propriety was definitely being tested. "If you do," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear, "I will catch you. I will always catch you, Arabella. No matter what threatens, no matter what challenges we face, you will never fall alone again." They danced in silence for several measures, lost in each other despite the other couples now joining them on the floor. Finally, Arabella spoke, needing to address something that had been on her mind since she had learned the full extent of what Frederick had done in the week since their engagement. "You restored my family's estates," she said quietly. "My mother told me that the Derbyshire property has suddenly become profitable again, that debts we thought insurmountable have been mysteriously satisfied, that we now have a comfortable income where before we had barely enough to manage. That was you, Frederick. Do not deny it." Frederick had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I may have made some investments on your family's behalf." The Derbyshire land was being poorly managed by an incompetent steward. Replacing him with someone who actually understands modern agricultural methods and investing in some improvements to the tenant cottages was simply good business sense. That the property happens to belong to your family is merely coincidental. Arabella stopped dancing, forcing Frederick to halt as well, and looked up at him with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and tenderness. "You terrible liar! There is nothing coincidental about it. You have made my family financially secure, so that when we marry, no one can say I accepted you out of necessity or gratitude, so that I come to you as an equal rather than as a charity case." Frederick's expression turned serious, all hint of teasing gone. "You are my equal, Arabella, with or without fortune. Your intelligence, your character, your capacity for love and compassion, these are worth more than any dowry. But yes, I wanted to ensure that our marriage was seen by all of society, and more importantly by you, as a choice freely made between equals. I wanted no whisper of speculation that you married me for my title or my wealth, and I wanted you to know that my love for you has nothing to do with gratitude or duty or any noble impulse to rescue someone in need. I love you for yourself alone, and I wanted our marriage to reflect that truth." Arabella felt tears threatening again, and blinked them back impatiently. "You are impossible," she said, but her voice was thick with emotion. "Impossible and wonderful, and I love you more than I can express." They resumed dancing, but Arabella was aware that they had become something of a spectacle, the other couples giving them a wide berth as though recognizing that the Duke and his intended were in a world of their own. She caught her mother's eye across the room and saw Mrs. Fairfax dabbing at her face with a handkerchief, clearly overcome with emotion at seeing her daughter so obviously cherished. Lydia stood nearby with a group of young people, looking proud and pleased that her sister had made such a brilliant match. As the waltz drew to a close, Frederick bent close and whispered, "Come with me. I have something to show you." He led her from the ballroom through one of the open windows onto the terrace, then down the steps into the garden beyond. Several other guests had also wandered outside to enjoy the evening air, but Frederick guided Arabella past them, deeper into the formal gardens, where pathways lined with lavender and rosemary wound between beds of late blooming flowers. The moon was rising, nearly full, casting silver light over the landscape and making the whole scene feel enchanted, removed from the ordinary world. They walked in companionable silence until they reached a small clearing where a stone bench sat beneath an ancient oak tree, its branches spreading overhead like a protective canopy. Frederick stopped there and turned to face Arabella, taking both her hands in his, and in the moonlight she could see that he looked almost nervous, an expression so unlike his usual ducal confidence that it made her smile. "What is it?" she asked gently. "What did you want to show me?" "Not show?" Frederick corrected. "Tell. Or rather, share." He drew a breath, and when he spoke his voice carried a vulnerability that made her heart ache. "Do you remember at the Moorland Musicale 2 years ago, when you laughed at my terrible poetry, when you told me that sincerity mattered more than technical perfection?" Arabella nodded, the memory as clear as though it had happened yesterday. "I remember every word of that conversation. It was the first time we truly spoke, the first time I realized you were more than just a duke, that you were a man with interests and passions beyond what society demanded." Frederick reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, the edges worn as though it had been handled many times. "I have been trying to write you proper poetry ever since that night," he said, "trying to capture in words what I feel for you, how you have transformed my life, what it means to love you and be loved by you. Every attempt has been terrible, stilted and awkward, and completely inadequate to express the truth of my feelings. But tonight, standing here with you in this garden, knowing that you have agreed to be my wife, knowing that we have a future together, built on honesty and partnership rather than schemes and shadows, the words finally came." He unfolded the paper and in the moonlight began to read, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in every line. "In shadows deep I walked alone, a duke but not a man, bound tight by duty's iron chains, by honor's rigid plan. Then laughter bright as morning sun broke through my careful walls, a lady fair with honey eyes, who heard when beauty calls. She saw not title land or wealth, but soul beneath the stone, and loved the man I'd hidden well, the heart I'd never shown. Through schemes and fears and desperate plots, through danger dark and deep, she chose to stay when flight seemed wise, to wake when I would sleep. No sonnet fine could capture truth of what her love has wrought, how she has made me whole again, has given what I sought. Not duty's cold and distant praise, not power's hollow glory, but partnership of equal hearts, our own unfinished story. The verses were simple, lacking the elaborate metaphors and formal structure that characterized great poetry, but they were perfect in their sincerity, in the raw honesty of emotion that infused every word. Arabella listened with tears streaming freely down her face now, uncaring that she was ruining her carefully applied cosmetics, caring only that Frederick had given her this gift of words that came straight from his heart. When he finished, he refolded the paper and held it out to her. "It is not Wordsworth or Byron," he said quietly. "It is not even particularly good poetry by any objective standard. But it is true, Arabella. Every word is true." She took the paper and clutched it to her chest, then reached up to cup his face in her hands, bringing him down so their foreheads touched. "It is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me," she whispered, "not because of technical perfection, but because it is you, honest and vulnerable and real. This is the Frederick I fell in love with, the man who hides beneath the ducal armor, but emerges for me." Frederick's arms came around her, pulling her close, and they stood there in the moonlit garden holding each other, two people who had found their way through schemes and danger, and their own stubborn attempts at noble sacrifice to arrive, finally, at this moment of perfect understanding. After a long while, Arabella pulled back slightly and smiled up at him. "Your verses mention our unfinished story. What do you imagine the next chapters will hold?" Frederick considered, his expression thoughtful. "A wedding in the chapel at Claiborne House, I think, with these same friends and family present. Nothing grand or ostentatious, just the people who matter celebrating our union. Then perhaps a wedding trip to Italy, since we have both always wanted to see the art and architecture there. After that, a life of partnership, of facing challenges together rather than trying to protect each other from a distance, of building something real and lasting." He paused, then added, with a slight smile, "Also, possibly children who will inherit your intelligence and my terrible tendency toward elaborate planning, which should make for very interesting household dynamics." Arabella laughed, the sound carrying across the garden. "Poor children, to be cursed with both those traits. Though I suppose with your stubborn nobility and my practical sensibility to balance each other out, they might turn out reasonably well adjusted." They stood together in comfortable silence for several more minutes, unwilling to break the spell of the moonlit garden and return to the celebration inside. Finally, Frederick sighed and brushed a kiss across her forehead. "We should go back before our absence is noted and causes talk. Though at this point I care very little what society thinks, I would prefer not to scandalize your mother on the evening of our engagement celebration." As they walked back toward the house, Arabella thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that first meeting at the Moorland Musicale, through 2 years of careful friendship, through the terror of Bennet's threat and the heartbreak of Frederick's false engagement, through schemes and sacrifices, and finally to honest declarations and freely chosen commitment. It had been circuitous and complicated, marked by misunderstandings and noble but misguided attempts at protection, but it had brought them here to this perfect September evening and a future that stretched ahead, bright with promise. They reached the terrace to find Henrietta and Viscount Moorland standing in conversation, the Viscount's hand resting possessively on Henrietta's waist, in a way that suggested his intentions were every bit as serious as Frederick's. Henrietta looked up as they approached and smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that transformed her usually cool features. "There you are. We were beginning to wonder if you had eloped and abandoned your own engagement celebration." Frederick laughed. "Tempting as that might be, I have promised Arabella a proper wedding with all due ceremony. No more schemes or shortcuts. Everything open and honest from this point forward." Henrietta's smile turned knowing. "Every great love needs a good scheme to get started. I was simply the scheming friend who helped set events in motion. Though I must say, watching you two dance around your feelings for 2 years while constructing increasingly elaborate plans to avoid simply confessing them was occasionally frustrating. A simple declaration at the Moorland Musicale could have saved everyone a great deal of trouble." Arabella and Frederick exchanged glances, then burst into simultaneous laughter. "She is not wrong," Arabella admitted. "We were rather spectacularly bad at the straightforward approach. It took mortal danger and a false engagement and my near exile to Scotland before we finally managed to simply talk to each other honestly. Though I suppose that makes the happiness we have found now all the sweeter for having been through hard won." They returned to the ballroom together, the 4 of them, 2 couples who had found love in different ways, but who shared the understanding of what it meant to claim happiness in defiance of society's expectations and restrictions. The celebration continued late into the night, with dancing and music and conversation that flowed as freely as the excellent wine from Frederick's cellars. At midnight, Frederick made a formal announcement of his engagement to Lady Arabella Fairfax, speaking of her character and intelligence and the honor she did him by accepting his proposal. Arabella stood beside him, her hand in his, and felt the weight of genuine approval and affection from the assembled guests, felt the warmth of being welcomed into Frederick's family and circle, not as an interloper or a woman above her station, but as someone who belonged, who had earned her place through her own merit and through the depth of love she shared with the man at her side. In the weeks that followed, the engagement would be celebrated throughout London society, the wedding would be planned and executed with appropriate ceremony, and Arabella would take her place as the Duchess of Claiborne, a role she would grow into with grace and confidence. But on this September evening in the ballroom at Claiborne House, surrounded by friends and family who loved them, Arabella and Frederick simply enjoyed the moment, the perfect culmination of a journey that had begun with terrible poetry at a musicale, and had led through schemes and shadows to arrive finally at honest love and freely chosen partnership. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Arabella stood once more in the garden, this time with Frederick's arm around her waist and her head resting on his shoulder, watching the moon set beyond the distant trees. Everything that had seemed impossible just months ago had become not only possible but real, and the future that had appeared so bleak when she sat among half-packed trunks in her Bloomsbury parlour now stretched ahead, filled with promise and joy. "You were right," she said softly, and felt Frederick's arm tighten around her. "About what? About catching me when I fall. About always being there. About us facing everything together." She turned in his arms to look up at his face, seeing in the moonlight the same love and devotion that she knew must be reflected in her own expression. "Thank you for being stubborn enough to come to me that rainy night, for refusing to let me go, for choosing us over duty and honor and all the elaborate plans that kept us apart." Frederick bent to kiss her, soft and slow and full of promise. "Thank you for staying, for choosing me, for loving the man beneath the title." He smiled against her lips, though I still maintain that my schemes, however misguided, came from a place of profound love. Arabella laughed and pulled him closer. "Your terrible schemes and all. Now take me inside before we scandalize the remaining guests by being too obviously besotted with each other." Hand in hand, they walked back to the house, to the warmth and light and the people who loved them, to the beginning of the life they would build together, to all the unfinished chapters of their story that would be written in honesty and partnership and love freely chosen. Behind them, the garden slept in moonlight, a silent witness to promises made and futures claimed, to the ending of one chapter and the glorious beginning of another.